Reynard Sinaga is the most prolific convicted rapist in UK criminal history, with him estimated to have raped and sexually assaulted at least 200 men between 2015 and 2017. Sinaga would stalk the streets of Manchester, UK, looking for victims who he would lure into his property and then assault them, with him filming his sickening crimes. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Reynard Sinaga was born on the 19th of February 1983 in Jambi, on the island of Sumatra, Indonesia. He was from a privileged upbringing, with his father being involved in banking. The family were wealthy, and Sinaga grew up not wanting for anything. Sinaga was raised Catholic and appears to have hidden the fact that he was gay from his parents, who wanted him to marry a woman and settle down and start a family. After completing a degree in architecture at the University of Indonesia in 2006, Sinaga moved to the UK in 2007 to begin to study for a master's degree in planning at the University of Manchester, which he completed in 2009, followed by him studying for a Master of Arts in Sociology, which he achieved in 2011. He then remained living in Manchester, and in 2012 he began to study for his doctorate degree in human geography, with him working on his thesis at the time of his arrest in 2017. During his time in the UK, Sinaga lived openly as a gay man and was sexually promiscuous. He would, however, change completely when his parents came to visit or when he would return home to Indonesia, with them apparently having no idea of his sexual orientation until his trial. Sinaga's base for his attacks was a flat in Princes Street, Manchester, right in the heart of the city and at the centre of the nightlife. His road was somewhere that people staggering home from a night out would pass by. People who met Sinaga saw an unassuming, 5'7", bespectacled, thin man. His social media presence showed the face he wished to portray to others. There were people who identified issues with him, which we'll return to later, but everyone who knew him was shocked by the monster he truly was. This would only be revealed in 2017, when his rampage was finally brought to an end by the police. In order to outline the horror in this case, it's necessary to start at the end and see how the offences of Sinaga came to light, which began with one phone call to the police on the 2nd of June 2017. On this date, the police received a phone call from a 21-year-old rugby player who stated that Sinaga had tried to rape him. This man said that he'd been on his way home from a night out when Sinaga had ushered him into his property. In his intoxicated state, the man agreed. Sinaga then tried to drug this man and was trying to rape him when he woke up, and he managed to fight him off. Sinaga was no match for a rugby player and, to put it mildly, he had the shit kicked out of him. The police attended and found Sinaga barely conscious on the floor, and initially they arrested the rugby player for causing grievous bodily harm, but they were suspicious of Sinaga and accompanied him to the hospital where he was chained to the bed. They seized his mobile phone from the property and demanded the PIN number from him. Sinaga initially gave the wrong PIN number, but eventually gave the right one, and the police officers were confronted with the video of Sinaga attacking the rugby player, which showed, unfortunately, that this individual had already been raped before he came to. Sinaga was arrested in the hospital bed for a single count of rape, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. Police returned to Sinaga's property and recovered dozens of phones, driving licenses, student IDs, wallets, watches, and Facebook screen grabs of men. All of these men were those that Sinaga had raped, and these were his trophies of his crimes. The true horror, though, was found on the phone the police had taken initially, and on this phone was hundreds of hours of Sinaga raping and sexually assaulting men. Sinaga anally raped almost all of his victims and would ejaculate both inside them and on their bodies. He used a condom during only one of his attacks, and, by some miracle, is not known to have infected any of his victims. This is based on the fact that he tested negative for all sexually transmitted diseases upon his arrest. This, of course, doesn't discount that he previously had an STD and then got it treated. He would also kiss his victims' bodies and on their mouths, Most of these victims were raped repeatedly over a number of hours. I feel sorry for the police officers who had to watch each and every one of these sickening videos. CCTV analysis and inquiries showed Sinaga's modus operandi, with him leaving his property late at night and trawling the local streets looking for lone, intoxicated men, who he then manipulated into coming back to his flat. This was by a number of ways, including giving them a safe space to sleep off their intoxication, ordering a taxi, or inviting them back to his flat for more drinks. Unfortunately, when we're drunk, we make bad decisions, and in this state, it may have seemed like a good idea to go with this unassuming, physically slight man for whatever reasons. This CCTV footage shows Sinaga going on the prowl for a victim.
When they got into the flat,
Sinaga would offer them a drink, spiked with the drug gamma hydroxybutyric acid, more commonly known as GHB. GHB is a drug actually used to treat sleep disorders and anxiety, and it acts by relaxing the nervous system. However, in large enough doses, it can cause unconsciousness, confusion, and memory loss. When the men were unconscious, Sinaga would rape them, filming his sickening crimes, clearly for his own sexual gratification at a later date. Police inquiries established that the first attack they could prove was on New Year's Day 2015, when a man was out for a night out, and the next thing he remembered was coming to, covered in vomit in Sinaga's flat, with no idea how he got there. Sinaga feigned concern and gave some story about this victim being too drunk to get home, and he gave him a place to stay. The victim actually apologized to Sinaga and went on his way, not knowing until 2 years later that he had been raped. Sinaga is thought to have prowled the streets most nights and committed several rapes per month. The police had the heartbreaking task of informing the victims of his offences. Using Sinaga's trophies and the content of the videos, they were able to identify 48 victims who they had to contact individually and inform them that they had been raped. Almost all of them had no idea that anything had happened to them, and the bottom of their world must have dropped out. However, at least 60 victims could not be identified. Forensic analysis and detailed police work led to Sinaga being suspected of raping at least 206 men between January 2015 and his arrest in 2017. Let that number sink in at least 206 men raped by this man in a 2.5-year period. Sinaga's method did not change, and he simply gave some sort of excuse when these people woke up to explain their presence in his flat, with him knowing full well they couldn't actually remember the true horror of their experience. Some people may be questioning why no one reported his behaviour to the police or suspected they had been raped. The unfortunate truth is that I believe that some of them probably did suspect they had been raped, but there's such a stigma about male sexual assault that they probably felt so ashamed, so violated and so dirty that they didn't want to admit to themselves or others what had happened. However, as will be illustrated later, a lot of his victims showed extraordinary bravery later on in court. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Sinaga pleaded not guilty to all charges, and there were 4 trials. Between the 1st of June 2018 and the 10th of July 2018, for crimes against 13 victims. Between the 1st of April 2019 and the 7th of May 2019, for crimes against 12 victims. Between the 16th of September 2019 and the 4th of October 2019, related to 10 victims. And finally, in December 2019, for offences related to a further 13 victims. The callousness of Sinaga was fully on display through each and every one of these hearings. He forced his victims to have to relive their ordeals, and the videos of the attacks were played in court. Sinaga appeared to be enjoying the trials, smirking throughout, and taking great pleasure in watching the videos of his attacks. The bravery of the victims has to be noted, as many of them testified in court and refused to do so behind screens, with them wishing to look Sinaga directly in the eyes. Other elements of Sinaga's depravity were fully exposed, including him sending friend requests to many of his victims on Facebook after the attacks, and the meticulous way that he collected trophies and documented his crimes. Sinaga would also boast to his friends about his sexual exploits, subtly admitting his crimes, with him saying that he would use a, quote, secret potion when having sex with men. Sinaga's defense was pathetic, with him claiming that all of his victims were consensual sexual partners, despite almost all of them being heterosexual and them obviously being unconscious in the videos. Some of the victims were heard snoring in the clips that were shown to the court. To no one's surprise, Sinaga was found guilty in all 4 trials, and was eventually convicted of crimes against 48 victims, including 136 counts of rape, 14 counts of sexual assault, 8 counts of attempted rape, and 1 count of assault by penetration. Sinaga was sentenced at the conclusion of each trial, but I want to focus on the sentence from his last trial in December 2019, which occurred on January the 6th, 2020, in front of Judge Suzanne Goddard Casey. She stated, quote, "You are a man of some intelligence and cunning, who has tried to counter each and every twist in the prosecution case as you gave evidence, hopeless though your efforts were. You showed no shame or remorse as the jury had to view hours of the most intimate footage. Your actions show you are a dangerous, deeply disturbed and perverted individual with no sense of reality. You described yourself as having behaved tenderly to the males who fell into your clutches. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of your actions were cold and calculated to avoid the males waking up during sex. You persisted in your denials of guilt in spite of the overwhelming nature of the evidence against you and the previous jury verdicts. You gave no thought to the deep distress and lasting psychological damage you will have caused these young men." Reference was also made to a probation pre-sentence report, where the author wrote, quote, "I am unable to conclude that Mr. Sinaga is anything other than extremely dangerous. His level of denial and the additional trials that are pending make it unlikely that the prison or probation service will make any progress with him in the foreseeable future." The judge then sentenced him. Reynald Sinaga was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 30 years in prison before he's able to apply for parole. This was then increased to 40 years at the Court of Appeal on the 11th of December 2020. This means Sinaga's earliest release date is 2060, when it will be 77 years of age. Given the level of danger he poses and his remorselessness, I think there's a strong likelihood that this man will spend the rest of his life behind bars. One of the senior police officers who led the investigation described Sinaga as, quote, a psychopath, and added, quote, had he not been a narcissist and a psychopath, anyone else faced with such damning evidence would have admitted to what they've done. I would agree with this wholeheartedly, and there are elements of Sinaga's personality noted by friends which give an idea of the sort of man he was. He was deeply self-absorbed, obsessed with his own physical appearance and his importance to the world in general. One of his former housemates claimed that they actually had an argument with Sinaga because he was convinced that if he died, all life would come to an end. He couldn't seem to imagine the world continuing without him due to how important he was. He was an extreme narcissist. I believe that Sinaga is a man without any conscience or any remorse. Everyone in the world is there for him, and he can use and abuse as much as he wants. I think that he sees no problem with raping these men. They were there for his pleasure, and their level of consent and the horrific emotional and psychological harm his actions caused was secondary to him getting his needs met. Potentially his self-entitled attitudes and beliefs stem from his privileged upbringing. Sinaga primarily targeted heterosexual men, and I think this gave him a thrill, but also enabled him to further degrade them, with him believing that these straight males would be especially traumatized if they found out they were raped by a man. I think that Sinaga pleaded not guilty in order to be the center of attention and to relive his crimes over and over again. This man is an absolute monster. Police believe that Sinaga began sexually assaulting men as far back as 2005, when he was in Indonesia, and I have little doubt that the 206 victims he created in the UK is likely just a small proportion of the true number of people he violated in both countries. It is possible that Reynard Sinaga is the most prolific rapist not only in the UK, but potentially in the world. Hopefully he will never be released. Robert Maudsley is one of the longest-serving prisoners in the UK and considered one of the most dangerous. For the last 44 years, Maudsley has been in solitary confinement, 39 of these in a purpose-built glass cage underneath H&P Wakefield, one of the most high-security prisons in the country, where he's not allowed contact with any other prisoners, and during the 1 hour he is allowed out each day, he's escorted by at least 4 to 6 prison officers. The reason for this is that Maudsley is a serial killer who has killed 4 people, 3 of them in prison. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Robert Maudsley was born on the 26th of June 1953 in Liverpool, UK. He was one of 12 children, with their father being a lorry driver, also called Robert, and his wife Jean. It appears that Maudsley's home life was hellish, and when he was 21 months old, he and some of his siblings were taken into care due to parental neglect. Maudsley and his siblings spent time in an orphanage being cared for by nuns, and it appears that this was the only period of stability in his life. During this time, unlike other children, Maudsley did not receive visits from his parents, and in some respects this was probably a good thing, as it gave him some distance from the abuse he had suffered. Unfortunately, at age 8, Maudsley was returned to the family home and continued to be abused by his father. One of his siblings later stated, quote, "It was just the old fella who hit us with his fists, belt and sometimes a stick, but our ma instigated half of it." Maudsley himself said, quote, "All I remember of my childhood is the beatings. Once I was locked in a room for 6 months and my father only opened the door to come in and beat me 4 or 6 times a day." It appears that Maudsley was singled out from his siblings for the worst of the abuse, and he claimed this included being sexually abused by his father. Maudsley alone was then taken back into care, with his parents telling his siblings that he was dead, so essentially cutting him off from any support. In around 1969, at age 16, Maudsley went to London and drifted around the city. He developed a drug habit and attempted suicide on numerous occasions, ending up in various psychiatric facilities where he expressed thoughts of killing his parents. In order to fund his drug habit, Maudsley committed some offences, but also worked as a rent boy, exchanging money for his sexual services. It was when working as a rent boy in 1974 that Maudsley met his first victim, a labourer called John Farrell, in Wood Green in North London. On March 14, 1974, Farrell engaged the services of Maudsley, and after they'd had sex, Maudsley claimed that Farrell showed him pictures of children he'd abused. Maudsley then took a length of cord and strangled Farrell to death. Maudsley surrendered himself to police, admitted what he'd done, and told them that he needed psychiatric care. Maudsley was found unfit to stand trial and, at the age of 21, was instead sent to Broadmoor. Broadmoor, or to give it its full name Broadmoor Hospital, is, as the name suggests, actually run by the National Health Service, and its role, like other psychiatric units, is to treat the mentally ill. However, Broadmoor is a high-security facility due to only admitting the most dangerous types of individuals who pose the gravest threat to themselves or others. Due to this, Broadmoor's 284 beds are mainly occupied by people who have come from prison, the courts or police stations, having either been convicted or awaiting trial for or arrested for extremely serious offences. On very rare occasions, Broadmoor admits people who have not committed any crimes yet, but are considered a danger of committing serious offences imminently. As it is a hospital, residents are known as patients, and the average stay at Broadmoor is 5 years, although some residents can spend the rest of their lives there. Once deemed well enough, the patient can then be transferred out, whether this be back to prison or to stand trial, etc. Although it's a hospital, Broadmoor's level of security is in line with a maximum security prison, including anti-escape measures, including rows of fencing, security cameras and a 20-foot surrounding wall. Anyway, also arrested in Broadmoor with Maudsley was David Cheeseman, a man with a history of violence, including attempting to murder a worker at another high-security psychiatric facility by hitting them over the head with a metal bar. Another patient was David Allen Francis, a convicted child molester. On the 26th of February 1977, when Maudsley was 23 years old, he and Francis played football whilst Cheeseman watched. After the game, Cheeseman asked a male nurse to open a door where they could change out of their football boots, and the three of them went inside. When the nurse went to follow them inside, Maudsley pushed the door closed, and Cheeseman barricaded the door with a footlocker. The pair then tied up Francis and proceeded to assault and torture him over the next 9 hours, before finally strangling him to death. Maudsley had armed himself with a sharpened spoon, and he rammed this into Francis's ears so hard it went into his brain. When they had finally killed him, Francis's body was held up and displayed to hospital staff who were able to peek in but not enter. Eventually, Maudsley and Cheeseman let them in to a sight of absolute horror. Francis's head had been, quote, split open, exposing his brain, which had the sharpened spoon stuck in it. Whilst this mode was horrific enough, there was a rumour that the spoon found in Francis's head was due to Maudsley trying to eat his brain, which then, through Chinese whispers, turned to the fact they had in fact done this and consumed other parts of Francis's body. However, this has been proven incorrect, but didn't stop Maudsley being dubbed the, quote, British Hannibal Lecter, after the famous antagonist of the Silence of the Lambs book and film. Curiously, whilst found unfit to stand trial after the first murder, Maudsley was considered competent to stand trial for the murder of Francis and was convicted before being sent to Wakefield Maximum Security Prison in West Yorkshire, dubbed the Monster Mansion, due to the number of high-risk sexual and violent offenders who were held there. On the afternoon of July the 29th, 1978, Maudsley, now 25 years old, killed 2 prisoners in the space of an hour in Wakefield Prison. Maudsley later stated he intended to kill 7 people that day. The first victim was a man named Sawney Darwood, who was serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. Maudsley apparently knew Darwood for some time, as Darwood was teaching him French. Maudsley advised him into his cell, and then attacked him, stabbing and hacking at him with a makeshift dagger and strangling him. Maudsley then hid the body under the bed in his cell. Maudsley then tried to lure other prisoners into the cell, but none of them would enter, so he went out looking for another victim. He's described as, quote, lurking on the prison wing when he came across William Roberts, a man serving a sentence for sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl who was lying on the bed in his cell. Maudsley attacked Robert, hacking him with the same dagger and smashing his head against the wall until he was dead. Maudsley then calmly walked up to a prison officer, dropped the bloody weapon on the table, and told them they would be too short at the next roll call. During his hearing for this double murder in 1979, the court heard that during his crimes Maudsley believed his victims were his parents. The killings, his lawyers argued, were the result of pent-up aggression resulting from a childhood of near constant abuse, with them stating that Maudsley had said, quote, when I kill, I think I have my parents in mind. Maudsley also apparently said, quote, if I had killed my parents in 1970, none of these people need have died. Maudsley was returned to Wakefield Prison and kept in solitary confinement and, as his picture shows, his movements outside of his cell were shadowed by prison officers. He gave one interview where the only pictures of him are taken from, and again, as you can see from this picture, he's surrounded by prison staff. In 1983, Maudsley was deemed to be too high a risk to other prisoners. It was decided he needs to be permanently housed away from them. So a separate prison cell was built in the basement of Wakefield Prison, essentially a prison within a prison. There are no pictures of this cell, but it's described as being 18 foot by 15 foot, or 5.5 metres by 4.6 metres, with walls being made of bulletproof glass so it can be observed from all angles. Within the cell itself is a table and chair, both made out of compressed cardboard, with the bed being a slab of concrete, and a toilet and sink which are bolted to the floor. In order to actually get to the area where he's housed, requires going through multiple security doors. Once at the cell, there's essentially an airlock which has to be gone through in order to stand face to face with Maudsley, being separated by more bulletproof glass, with there being a slot through which his meals and other items are passed to him. Maudsley is watched by officers 24 hours a day. He is allowed out of his cell once a day, but is escorted to an exercise yard by between 4 to 6 prison officers. This cell is described as closely resembling that of Hannibal Lecter in the film The Silence of the Lambs, but Maudsley's current accommodation was built 8 years before this film was released. The combination of the layout of Maudsley's cell and previous erroneous reports about him eating part of his victims has continued to fuel the perception of him as being the British Hannibal Lecter. However, Thomas Harris, the author of the books, has never stated the character or his prison cell was inspired in any way by Maudsley. Robert Maudsley is now 69 years old, has spent the last 44 years in solitary confinement, 39 of these in his specially constructed cell, where he will remain until the end of his life. I want to preface this part of the video by saying that overall I don't support solitary confinement. It's obviously an extreme measure which causes significant emotional and psychological harm and is sometimes used as a way to simply torment others. An example is the recent unrest in Myanmar, with politicians held in these conditions after the military coup in 2021. However, I'm struggling not to think that in some cases there's little other choice when it comes to extremely dangerous offenders. Maudsley's prolonged solitary confinement has been in the news on and off over the years, including in the year 2000, when Maudsley petitioned the courts for a relaxation of his conditions or, if this was refused, access to lethal drugs to end his life. At the same time, Maudsley was in correspondence with a journalist from the Times newspaper and wrote the following letter, quote, "How did I find myself in permanent solitary confinement at Wakefield? I first killed a man outside and found myself in Broadmoor. I then killed a fellow patient at Broadmoor and eventually found my way to Wakefield, where I killed 2 fellow inmates. It's on my record that I served numerous periods of solitary confinement at Broadmoor prior to killing a fellow patient. It's also on my record that I underwent a long period of solitary confinement in various prisons prior to my arrival at Wakefield and placement on normal location. At no time in Broadmoor or those prisons did I receive any kind of psychological or psychiatric assistance or help." Numerous national newspapers and tabloids have labelled me Britain's own Hannibal Lecter, etc. All very sensational, no doubt, and I've received numerous letters from people over the years who have watched this film Silence of the Lambs and who believe it's a genuine portrayal of my life story. They are of course entitled to their beliefs, however a more accurate portrayal will be a film called Murder in the First. I mention this because an important question for these people to ask would be to what extent my conditions and environment and treatment at Broadmoor and HP Wakefield played in causing me to react in such a savage manner. As you know, I don't see any psychologists nor any psychiatrists currently. It seems Wakefield is happy to place me in permanent solitary confinement after killing 2 of its prisoners. Actually, all Wakefield has sought to do since 1978 is to demonise me. He also wrote, quote, "Do we all not form our opinions, beliefs, etc. from how we perceive that environment? Wakefield prison authorities perceive me as a problem. Their solution to that problem to date has been in effect to bury me alive. The cage ultimately for them being my concrete coffin, but is that the final solution? What purpose is being served by keeping me locked up 23 hours a day? Why even bother to feed me and to give me 1 hour's exercise a day, month and year, yet not allow me to talk to any other inmates via their windows? Who am I actually a risk to?" Let me try to briefly answer that by saying I killed rapists, paedophiles and sex offenders. No other type of person nor other type of offender. So my past crime strongly suggests this is the group most and solely at risk. Why is this? I can say that yes, I've been raped, and yes, I've been sexually abused by such people, and consequently, I do detest these people enough to have killed them in the past. I have no previous convictions for killing prison officers, and I have no previous convictions for seriously wounding nor stabbing any prison officers. and I cannot perceive nor can I imagine any situation in which this would arise. Maudsley also told the reporter that he'd asked the courts for a budgie and that he would take care of it and, quote, not eat it. The Times article I read from this time is very sympathetic to Maudsley and his living conditions and the apparent inhumanity of his situation. I looked online at various message boards and comments in response to this article and other articles about Maudsley and his living situation, and there seem to be a lot of people who perceive him as a hero, with them stating that he only killed child sex offenders, so what's the problem? These also seem to be mixed with general anti-establishment messages, including this one from 2000, which I found particularly odd to say the least. This comment describes Maudsley as, quote, a truly superior, insightful, brilliant, soul-alive philosopher. It goes further by stating, quote, I honour Robert's choice to speak out to the media and condemn the brutalisation, the inhumanity with which he has been treated. 46-year-old Robert is one of only 26 UK prison inmates who've been sentenced to life in prison with no chance of ever being released. Now Robert is demanding to be treated as a human being, or else he says he'd rather be murdered by the state. All he wants is to be treated as any human being in the 21st century deserves, at the very least. His voice, as published in the letter excerpts, is a cry of sanity in an insane society. In a sane society, 1 million people in England would rise up as one, together, and demand this tortured child victim, who has been unjustly tormented by society for his entire life, be finally treated as a victim worthy of limitless apology, affection, understanding, support, and only benevolent, never punitive treatment. It continues, quote, I honour your martyrdom, Robert. If there was any justice in the world, you would have a thermonuclear bomb capable of destroying all of humanity in your hands with the launch codes, and you yourself would be asked to decide whether the human race deserves to continue to exist. You're entitled to make this decision, Robert. You alone, based upon the unforgivable lifetime of unjust torment that your society initiated against you when you were a baby, has inflicted and continues to inflict upon you. Okay, that's an extreme example, but I think it illustrates my overall point that I think Maudsley's case has been romanticised to make him out to be some sort of vigilante who only targeted child sex offenders rather than a vicious, dangerous killer. Whilst Maudsley claimed that his first victim showed him images of sexual abuse and that's why he killed him, and 2 of his other 4 victims were sex offenders, one, Stanley Darwood, was in prison for murder, and Maudsley seemed to have no problem with interacting with him before that to learn French. This doesn't fit the pattern and strikes me as something personal. Also, Maudsley was described as quite prowling the wing looking for other people to kill. I think it's difficult not to conclude that he was simply looking for anyone to kill, and came across William Roberts, killing him simply because he was in his cell and available, rather than potentially anything to do with his offending. So, whilst it's clear that Maudsley has an understandable hatred of sex offenders, I think that potentially he was just wanting to kill as many people as possible for his own reasons, potentially because of the rage towards his parents and society, due to the fact that he felt victimised and abandoned. I don't believe that Maudsley did what he did to make society a better place. His actions are far more self-centred and selfish. Perhaps because of our natural revulsion of those who harm children, it's been twisted into something more poetic than it is. The question is really, would you trust Maudsley around your family? Was Maudsley failed by society? Quite possibly. However, while sympathetic to this, many people have horrific upbringings, but they don't then use this to justify taking the lives of others. Maudsley had opportunities to be within the general population in custody, but he used this to murder not 1, not 2, but 3 people. I know the tone of his letter was to try and plead his case and highlight the injustice of his situation, but I can't help but note the self-justification in his words, blaming others for his actions and appearing to link the conditions in Broadmoor and Wakefield directly to his criminality. However, it's a circular argument. He apparently blames Wakefield for him committing the offences, but feels aggrieved that they took issue with the fact that he then murdered 2 inmates, so he blames them for what happened and then blames them for the outcome. He states that Wakefield considers him a, quote, problem. Well, yes, because you killed other prisoners. Ultimately, I'm not sure what Maudsley expects. To be taken at his word that he would only kill certain types of people and therefore should be allowed out in the general population? How the prison service would even manage this is unclear. They would have to basically vet any prisoner who came anywhere near Maudsley to check their criminal record. However, what about someone he simply thinks is a child molester? Would he then kill them? Stripping away all the other details, Robert Maudsley killed 4 people, and therefore he's clearly a man who likes killing others for whatever reason, and who, because of this, the prison service had to build a special cell just for him and surround him with guards whenever he leaves it. In terms of being a martyr and tortured, It's clear that his basic needs are being met. He's sheltered and fed and is allowed out of his cell. The only thing missing is company, and Morsley has ensured that's not possible due to killing those around him. However, it should be noted he does have visits from family members. To illustrate the continued danger of this man, more recently, in 2022, there was some publicity about letters Morsley had written to his nephew, in which he seems to have come to terms with being in solitary confinement, where he apparently spends his time playing video games, but he also disclosed that, if he was ever released, he would kill again. Mark Hobson was born on the 2nd of September 1969 in Wakefield, West Yorkshire in the UK. Hobson's childhood was described by friends as, quote, happy and stable, and he grew up with his parents Peter and Sandra and his two sisters Melanie and Leslie. The family eventually moved to Selby, North Yorkshire. However, despite apparently there being no issues in his childhood, Hobson soon began displaying extreme violence towards others, including in 1990 when he viciously attacked a girlfriend. In 1991, Hobson moved in with his childhood sweetheart Kay and her two children. The pair had a daughter together and married in 1993. Hobson worked at various jobs, including a landscape gardener and as a nightclub doorman in 1998. Hobson then, without any warning, informed Kay that he was leaving the marriage, and on the 1st of January 1999, he simply walked out of the family home. Kay later said, quote, there was no one else involved. He just didn't want married life anymore. It was bizarre. I couldn't believe it. He turned to pot and drinking heavily. He never drank when we were married, but now he got off his face. He became like a zombie. His life just went completely off the rails. Hobson's life indeed went off the rails, and he spent the next few years floating around, and his alcohol use and use of drugs, particularly cannabis, increased. Hobson was apparently soon drinking approximately 35 cans of strong beer a day. In March 2002, a man called William Brace was walking through Selby town centre when, across the road, he spotted his ex-girlfriend with Hobson. William was not too happy about this, his ex-girlfriend and his friend now going out, and so he went across the road to confront them. As he approached, William felt a pain in his stomach and believed that Hobson had punched him. However, when he noticed the blood, he realised he'd been stabbed. In quick succession, Hobson stabbed William a further 5 times in broad daylight in front of shocked passers-by. He used a box cutter that he'd taken from his place of work in a factory. William lay bleeding in the street, and Hobson was apparently enjoying watching him bleed to death. Despite significant blood loss and a punctured lung, William survived. Hobson was arrested and ended up in court, where he admitted to wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. In the UK, this is a serious offence, one step down from attempted murder. So you had an unprovoked attack with multiple stab wounds in broad daylight in front of numerous witnesses, and Hobson's punishment was, brace yourself, a 2-year probation order and 100 hours of community service. Mark Hobson should have received a significant custodial sentence for this incident, and had he would have been safely behind bars, and none of the horror that was about to take place would have happened. Claire Sanderson was aged 26 when she met Hobson, when they worked together at the same packaging plant in Selby in 2003. She had a twin sister called Diane. Claire and Hobson shared a mutual love of Tracy Chapman records and drinking, and they quickly became a couple, with people stating that Claire was, quote, smitten with Hobson. By April 2003, Claire had convinced her parents to lend her money for a deposit for a flat, and her and Hobson moved in together. However, Hobson began to demonstrate extreme violence towards Claire almost immediately, and he didn't care who saw what he was doing. On one occasion, a local man dragged Hobson off Claire when he was physically stood on her whilst holding a 12-inch butcher's knife to her neck. On another occasion, Hobson was seen punching Claire repeatedly in the face whilst holding her around the neck. Over the next year, Claire was the victim of repeated acts of violence, which resulted in the police being called on repeated occasions. But she appeared to be unable to give up on Hobson, with people stating that she, quote, followed him around like a lapdog. By the beginning of July 2004, Hobson was telling friends that he, quote, chose the wrong sister and that he was going to, quote, have Claire's twin sister Diane. On Sunday, the 11th of July 2004, Hobson put his plan to remove Claire and pursue Diane into action. In the evening of this day, Claire and Hobson spent time drinking in a pub before going back to their flat. When they returned, Hobson attacked Claire, hitting her 17 times in the head with a hammer, killing her. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and hid it in their bedroom. Claire's family noticed her absence quickly, and Hobson began stalling for time, telling them that Claire was sick or out visiting friends, but they were clearly becoming concerned. Little did they know that Hobson was planning his next murder and was reading survival manuals, anticipating that, when he was finished, he would need to go on the run. On the 17th of July 2004, 6 days after killing Claire, Hobson called her twin sister Diane and told her that Claire had glandular fever and was too ill to talk, but wanted her to visit. Diane left the home she shared with her mother and father and eagerly turned up. At 7:30 p.m, she stepped over the threshold into the flat, not knowing that her sister's body was wrapped in bin bags just up the stairs. Hobson then attacked her and, after hog-tying her, tortured her with scissors and razor blades to cut and stab her, including mutilating her genitals. She was also sexually assaulted, and he bit off her left nipple, which is believed that he swallowed. Hobson placed a bag over Diane's head and repeatedly beat her with a hammer. Eventually, Hobson strangled Diane to death. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and lay it next to that of her sister, whose body by now was starting to decompose. Diane's death was noticed almost immediately, as, after visiting her sister, she was meant to be going to meet her boyfriend at the pub. At approximately 8:45 p.m, the boyfriend, Ian Harrison, called Diane's mobile to find out where she was. Hobson answered the phone and made up a story that Claire and Diane's father, George Sanderson, had had a heart attack, so they had both rushed to be by his bedside. Ian was actually an old friend of Hobson's, so the pair arranged to meet at the pub instead. Hobson turned up, and he's described as being calm and showing absolutely no sign that he just viciously murdered Ian's girlfriend and now had 2 bodies in his bedroom. Remarkably, Hobson actually invited Ian to come back to the property. Why is unclear. Potentially he was intending to murder him, although he didn't eventually do this. When Ian turned up, he noticed an odd smell, which was the smell of Claire's decomposing body, which Hobson said was the drains, and he spotted blood on the sofa, which Hobson said was due to Claire's, quote, woman's problems. Hobson even invited Ian to stay the night, which he refused. When Ian used the toilet, Hobson stood behind him, and it was only later that Ian realised why, as this was to stop him from going into the bedroom, the room opposite, where the 2 bodies were lying on the floor. Ian went home, and by 7 a.m. the next morning, the 18th of July, he had still not heard from Diane and was beginning to worry. He went round to Diane's house, and when her father George opened the door in perfect health, he knew something was wrong. Ian and George went to Hobson's flat and forced entry. There, they found the mutilated and abused bodies of both women, but no sign of Hobson, who, by this point, had fled. The police were called, and they found evidence almost straight away which showed that the murders were premeditated, with them recovering a, quote, to-do list in the property. On it was a shopping list of items, including bin bags, duct tape, cable ties, fly spray, and air freshener, as well as a plan to lure Diane to the property, with, quote, use and abuse at will, being written by her name. Also written was a list of targets, including Diane and Claire's parents, as well as his ex-wife Kay. It was obvious who committed the murders, and the police began looking for Hobson. But unfortunately, by this point, he had already murdered 2 more people. After Ian had left the flat in the late evening of the 17th of July 2004, Hobson called his mother and claimed that, rather than being dead and their bodies wrapped up in the bedroom, Diane and Claire had been in a road traffic accident and had been badly injured and taken to hospital. Hobson asked for a lift to the hospital, which was in York. Hobson's mother picked him up and drove him the 15 miles to the hospital, arriving at around 2 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004. She then sat in the car park and Hobson went in. He returned a short time later and told his mother that the sisters were receiving treatment and that he was going to stay. Hobson's mother then drove off and assumed that her son would make his own way back later. Why Hobson went through this pantomime is unclear. I assume it was to get out of the area without alerting his mother, but why did he want to go to this area specifically? We will never know. We also don't know what he did for the next few hours, but what we do know is that he travelled on foot to a small village called Strensall, which is about 6 miles away from the hospital. Living there were James Britton, aged 80, and his wife Joan, aged 81, a couple who'd been married for over 50 years and were enjoying their twilight years together. James had a condition similar to Parkinson's disease and was deaf and walked with a stick. Joan is described as being even more frail, and she too walked with a stick. At 8:55 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004, neighbours of the Brittons popped in to check on them and then left. Sometime between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m, Hobson broke into the property and attacked both James and Joan, beating them both with their own walking sticks. He then stabbed both of them. In the case of Joan, Hobson knocked her to the ground and stabbed her with such force that the blade went through her body and stuck in the floor underneath her. The blade then snapped off, so she was found in this state, the blade and the knife still in her body, when at 11:15 a.m, a neighbour again came to check on the couple and found a scene of absolute horror. The home had been ransacked, apparently due to Hobson looking for money. Hobson had made no real attempts to cover his tracks, and his fingerprints were found all over the property, including in the couple's blood. Police quickly attended and connected both crime scenes, and Mark Hobson became Britain's most wanted man. Police quickly began running through the list of places that Hobson could have gone to ground, including his friends and family. What they didn't know was that Hobson was hiding out in some fields, approximately 5 miles outside of the outskirts of York, in a village called Shipton by Benningborough, apparently using the survival skills that he'd learned from various books he'd read. However, he was clearly no Bear Grylls, as Hobson soon ran out of water, and a week after the murders of James and Joan Britton, on the 25th of July 2004, Hobson walked into a petrol station to buy matches, cigarette papers, and a bottle of water. He was instantly recognised by staff at the petrol station, and the police were called. Armed police swarmed the area, and within minutes, Hobson was arrested. As he was led away, Hobson said to the police, quote, "I'm a fucking murderer, aren't I?" Mark Hobson admitted all 4 killings at court, and, on the 25th of May 2005, appeared for sentencing at Leeds Crown Court before Mr. Justice Grigson. Justice Grigson said, quote, "The enormity of what you've done is beyond words, and, quote, the damage you've done is incalculable. You have not only destroyed the lives of your victims, but you devastated the lives of those who loved them." Mark Hobson appeared to show no remorse for his actions. He then sentenced him. Mark Hobson was jailed for life and given a whole life tariff, meaning that he will never be released. In November 2005, Hobson appealed his sentence to the Court of Appeal, stating he should have got some credit for admitting to the murders at the first opportunity and not putting their families through the ordeal of a trial. This appeal was refused. Mark Hobson started his life in the town of Wakefield, and his life has come full circle, with him being sent to HMP Wakefield, a Category A prison I've mentioned on several occasions, as it's where the most dangerous criminals in the UK are held, and is dubbed the, quote, Monster Mansion. Hobson's guilty plea meant that he didn't have to give an explanation for his crimes in court. However, in 2006, it was revealed that Hobson had begun writing to a former friend, called Donna Kempt, with her saying, quote, he doesn't like to dwell on the past, but he said that he and Claire rowed on the day he killed her, and he flipped, and he went on to murder them all. It was the booze more than the drugs which sent him over the edge. Hobson reportedly told Donna, quote, at first I couldn't remember what had happened. Now the memories are coming back, and they do haunt me. Hobson also boasted about how he'd passed his GCSE and A-level in maths, and quipped that one day he would have, quote, more qualifications than Stephen Hawking. In response to these revelations, Ian Harrison, Diane's partner, stated, quote, it doesn't matter how many qualifications he gets, he'll never be able to use them. He's never going to be released, and that is it. When he launched his appeal, that really set me back, but now at least I know he'll rot in jail, and when he's dead, he'll rot in hell. George Sanderson, Claire and Diane's father, stated, quote, it doesn't matter what Hobson says, he's just pure evil. Alcohol doesn't make you do what he did. It's because he's such a twisted person. He can never say sorry to us. We can't even look at our daughter's photographs without thinking about what he did. It's too hard to even talk about it, and whatever he said won't make any difference. Almost 20 years after this horrific quadruple murder, Mark Hobson remains in prison, where he'll spend the rest of his miserable existence. When I was looking into Mark Hobson, I didn't find any indicators of abuse when he was growing up or exposure to violence. These are often factors which result in people developing pro-violent attitudes, which they then display later in their lives. However, just because it isn't obviously written somewhere doesn't mean it didn't happen, as there's likely some reason why Hobson developed to the monster he did, or perhaps he was simply born evil. However, what is clear is that he was trying to excuse his behaviour by saying, the alcohol made me do it. George Sanderson hit the nail on the head when he said alcohol didn't make him do it, he was just a twisted person, and that's correct. Alcohol and drugs don't create violence, or everyone who used them would start acting in that way. Alcohol and drugs just lower people's inhibitions and allows them to more easily act on their pre-existing violent and aggressive attitudes. Hobson blaming his alcohol and drug use makes no sense. Okay, maybe he was under the influence when he killed Claire, but he planned the death of Diane and had thought through what he needed to conceal their bodies and stop the smell of decay. Instead, I think that Mark Hobson was a man who saw others merely as objects he could use and abuse, and when he got tired of them, he felt the right to simply dispose of them. With regards to Claire, Hobson clearly thought that she was his property, something he could victimise any way he wanted, and this included abusing her in the street in full view of members of the public. He believed that he picked the wrong sister, so rather than leaving Claire and potentially trying to begin a relationship with Diane, as a normal person might do, he decided to get rid of Claire entirely and kill her, like one would dispose of an item they no longer have a use for. However, Hobson wasn't interested in any sort of mutual relationship with Diane. He just wanted to use and abuse her, before again disposing of her like rubbish. I believe what likely happened was that Diane attended the property, Hobson tried to initiate some sort of sexual contact, she rejected him, and he decided that she needed to die. The deaths of James and Joan Britton were completely gratuitous. Both individuals were elderly, and if Hobson's intention was just to rob them, he could simply have threatened them and got what he wanted. Potentially because of their level of vulnerability, he could have just walked in and taken what he wanted, and walked out, knowing full well they couldn't fight back. However, I think he saw two vulnerable people that he could use and abuse, and that he killed them for kicks. He knew that, when he was caught, he'd be going to prison forever, so thought he would just cause as much chaos as possible. Mark Hobson is just a cowardly, evil man who has no consideration for the life of anyone else. Potentially he is haunted by what he's done, and I hope that's the case. And I hope that he ends his life behind the confines of prison walls. Just a quick addition. I outlined the behaviours and motivations of domestic abuse perpetrators in my video about the horrific murder of Kellyanne Bates. Check out that video if you have time. In that video, I outlined how domestic abuse perpetrators are ultimately motivated by gaining and maintaining power and control over their victims, using various tactics including violence, threats of violence, verbal abuse, etc. The case of Hobson raises another major warning flag in domestic abuse cases, and that is men who abuse their partners in full view of others, whether this be members of the family or members of the public. Often, domestic abuse perpetrators will try to hide their behaviour, knowing that if they're seen, someone will intervene. So there is ultimately some semblance within them that they know what they're doing is wrong and they try to conceal it from others. However, some men, especially the most dangerous ones, don't care. They will abuse their partners in any environment. This usually shows two things. Firstly, their normalised view of violence, with them seeing nothing wrong with acting in this way, and also likely their confidence about how much control they have over their victim, with them thinking that even if I beat her up in the middle of the street, she won't report me to the police and I'll get away scot-free. With Hobson, he saw no issue with standing on Claire whilst wielding a knife in the middle of the street. Unfortunately, in the UK, and I assume around the world, many perpetrators do get away with their crimes because their victims refuse to make a statement against them, so any case falls apart. This is often through fear, with the victim fearing that if they do report the crime to the police, then they'll come to serious harm, or potentially even be murdered. However, if you see someone being abused in the middle of the street, there are a few things you can do. Firstly, if it's safe, intervene. I think it's all our responsibility to try and protect people who are being abused by their partners. Secondly, if you see something like this, get your mobile phone out and film it, obviously from a safe distance. This isn't for morbid curiosity, but if you can capture what's going on, it's evidence. And even if the victim doesn't support a case, then you may be able to provide enough information that they can pursue what's known in the UK as a victimless prosecution, where, even if the victim withdraws their statement or complaint, there's enough evidence that people like this can't get away with it. Albert Fish was an American serial killer, once described as, quote, the most vicious child slayer in criminal history. And, despite almost 90 years having passed since his death, I believe that he's still a strong contender for this horrific title. The reason for this is that Fish targeted young children who he raped, murdered, and apparently ate. Fish is known to have committed 3 murders, being executed for one of these, but is suspected of killing many more. He was also a sexual masochist, inserting needles into his own genitals for sexual pleasure. There are so many levels of depravity to Albert Fish, which earned him several nicknames, including the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Boogeyman, and the Grey Man. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Hamilton Howard Fish, who throughout his life wished to be known as Albert, was born on May the 19th, 1870, in Washington, D.C., to Randall and Ellen Fish. The dynamic in Fish's household was strange from the start, with his father being 75 years old at his birth, 43 years older than his mother, who was 32. Fish's mother Ellen had visual and auditory hallucinations and was likely suffering from schizophrenia, whilst his uncle was diagnosed with, quote, mania, so likely bipolar disorder, and spent time in a mental institution. One of his brothers was also diagnosed with, quote, mental affliction. In 1875, when Fish was 5 years old, his father, Randall, died of a heart attack, and his mother, Ellen, due to suffering from financial hardship, placed him in St. John's Orphanage, where he stayed for the next 5 years. During this time, Fish reported to have been physically abused on a regular basis, receiving beatings, which he realised he found sexually gratifying. So instead of avoiding wrongdoing, he would break the rules in order to be in these situations to get his kicks. Fish also implied that he saw boys abusing other boys and the custodians harming the children in various ways, both physically and likely sexually in both cases. In 1880, Ellen was able to secure a job and so took Fish out of the orphanage, but by this point, the damage was done. So you have indicators of Fish likely having a genetic predisposition towards mental illness, being raised in an environment where he was likely exposed to bizarre and unstable behaviour, who, at a young age, was subjected to physical violence and witnessed the same, which he saw was a way to get power over others, as well as sexual gratification. Lastly, it's clear he had a propensity towards exploring deviant sexual behaviours and practices. This combination resulted in Fish, from the moment he left the orphanage in 1880 at the age of just 10 years old, devoting his life to absolute depravity and the abuse of others. As an aside, I want to say that human sexual behaviour is obviously on a very wide spectrum, with people getting gratification from a variety of different acts and stimulus. Most of these fit within a list, albeit quite a long list. However, some people move outside of this quote normal spectrum and begin to be drawn to things that are risky and often illegal. For example, those who begin to watch material depicting bestiality, so sexual contact with animals and people. It appears that these people aren't attracted to animals, but it's more the fact that what they're watching is wrong, which gives them a thrill and leads to the gratification. Without intervention, these people keep searching for more and more extreme material and experiences to get the same high again. Albert Fish appears to have been at this stage, i.e. off the scale of normal, at the age of only 10 years old, so you can imagine how bad his pursuit of ever more grotesque acts to gain sexual gratification got over the next 50 years. It began with him developing sexual arousal to the practice of drinking urine and eating human feces when he was only 12 years old, which he was introduced to by a boy of the same age he began a sexual relationship with. Fish would also engage in voyeurism, going to public bathhouses where he would see young boys undress. In 1890, Fish moved to New York City and began working as a male prostitute. He also began to molest children, specifically small boys. Fish quickly developed a specific typology of victim, with him targeting those who had learning disabilities or African American children, because he believed that these individuals would be less likely to tell the authorities and be less likely to be believed. Fish would lure them to his house, torture them for hours, often with a paddle covered in nails, rape them, and initially release the children alive. In 1898, Albert Fish married a woman called Anna Mary Hoffman. This was an arranged marriage, and I have no doubt set up to try and offset the rumours that would inevitably have been swirling around about his lifestyle. However, this marriage ended in 1917 when Anna ran off with another man, leaving Fish alone with their 6 children. During the marriage, and after Anna had left, he got his children to beat him on the bottom with the paddle covered in nails, which he used on other children, until he bled. He'd also taken to inserting needles into his body, specifically in his groin area. As another form of masochism, Fish would put wool doused in lighter fluid into his anus, which he would then light. Also around this time, Fish showed signs of mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, including believing that he was communicating with John the Apostle. On another occasion, one of Fish's sons describes an incident in 1922 when his father climbed the hills of Westchester, threw up his hands to the sky, and began screaming, quote, "I am Christ." Growing up in this household must have been absolutely hellish. In the early stages of the marriage, Fish did come to the attention of the authorities when, in 1902, aged 32, he was arrested, convicted, and incarcerated for larceny, being sent to Sing Sing prison, where he would be executed years later. However, as the marriage progressed, Fish's external activities were becoming more serious. Specifically, Fish later claimed that, in 1910, aged 40, he met a 19-year-old intellectually disabled man called Thomas Keedon whilst working in Wilmington in Delaware, and the pair began a sadomasochistic relationship. At some point, Fish lured Thomas into a farmhouse and claimed that he tortured him for 2 weeks, culminating in him cutting his penis in half. Fish later stated with regards to this act, quote, "I shall never forget his screams or the look he gave me." Fish claimed he intended to kill Thomas, but decided against it, so dressed the wound, gave him $10, and then, quote, "took the first train I could get home. Never heard what became of him or tried to find out." In addition, Fish claimed that in 1919 he stabbed a mentally disabled child in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. On July the 11th, 1924, Fish found 8-year-old Beatrix Keel playing alone on her parents' Staten Island farm. He offered her money to come and help him look for rhubarb in the neighbouring fields. She was about to leave the farm with him when her mother came out and chased Fish away. Albert Fish also claimed to have tried to lure a neighbourhood child called Cyril Quinn and his friend into his apartment on the pretext of eating sandwiches. Apparently, when these children were wrestling on his bed, they dislodged the mattress, and upon finding a knife, small hacksaw, and meat cleaver, implements Fish called, quote, implements of hell, they ran away. Eventually, Fish escalated to killing small children and mutilating their bodies. In chronological order, Albert Fish's first likely victim was 9-year-old Francis McDonnell, who failed to return home after playing catch with his friends in Port Richmond, Staten Island, on July the 12th, 1924. A search was organised, and Francis's body was found suspended from a tree in a wooded area close to his home. He'd been tortured, as shown by numerous cuts to his legs and abdomen, with his flesh around his left hamstring being completely removed. Francis had also been sexually assaulted and finally strangled with his own suspenders before being strung up from a tree where he was found. Other children who'd been playing with Francis told the police they'd seen an elderly man with a grey moustache walking around, mumbling to himself and making strange gestures with his hands. This suspect became known as, quote, the Grey Man. It was only when arrested years later for a separate crime that the Grey Man was identified as being Albert Fish. On February the 11th, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was playing with his friends, two brothers who were 3 and 12 years old, in a hallway of a Brooklyn apartment. The 12-year-old went into his apartment, and when he came back into the hallway, both younger boys had disappeared. The 3-year-old was later found on the roof of the apartment, but Billy was nowhere to be found, and the 3-year-old said, quote, the boogeyman took him. A worker on a tram said that he saw a man with a young boy who matched Billy's description. The boy was crying for his mother and was dragged off the tram by the man. Police later identified the boy as being Billy, and the worker later identified Albert Fish as being the man after seeing a picture of him. Billy's body was never recovered, so what happened to him can only be taken from Fish's confession, which he dictated to his attorney after his arrest years later. I'll read out the confession, but please note, it's explicit, and if it's not obvious from the context, monkey refers to Billy's penis, and its peewees his testicles. So Fish stated, quote, I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There's a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked, and tied his hands and feet, and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took a trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m, I took tools, a good heavy cat of nine tails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves into 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below his belly button. Then through his legs, about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and the legs below the knee. This I put in sacks, weighed with stones, tied the ends, and threw them into the pools of slimy water you'll see all along the road go to North Beach. Water is 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best. his monkey and peewees and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, piece of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when the meat had roasted about a quarter of an hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet, fat little behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, but his peewees I could not chew. Threw them in the toilet. As Billy's remains were never found, none of Fish's claims could actually be verified. On May the 25th, 1928, Albert Fish saw a classified advert in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, quote, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country, Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." 3 days later, Fish, on the 28th of May 1928, travelled to the Budd family residence and claimed to be a farmer called Frank Howard, who could hire Edward and a friend of his. Fish later stated that his intention was to abduct and mutilate Edward, then leave him to bleed to death. Fish left saying he would send for the boys in the next few days, but this didn't happen. He sent a handwritten note to the Budd family apologising and stating that he would soon return. When Fish did return, on the 3rd of June 1928, the family invited him in for lunch, and during this visit, he spotted Edward's younger sister, Grace, who was just 10 years old. Fish stated that he would take Edward and his friend on at the farm, but first he was going to a birthday party and asked if Grace would like to come. The family saw no issue with this genial, 58-year-old, grey-haired man that was apparently going to help them get out of poverty, so they made a fatal mistake. They agreed. Grace then left with Fish, and that was the last time she was seen alive. Fish then took Grace, boarded a train, and eventually ended up taking her to an abandoned building, where, unfortunately, her life ended in horrific fashion. When Grace did not return that evening, her family called the police. However, the investigation was hampered because Frank Howard, a farmer from New York, simply didn't exist. As with many serial killers, Fish was undoing what is needed to brag and gain attention for his despicable behaviour. It was in November 1934, so 6 years after the abduction of Grace, that Albert Fish showed his hand. And he did this via an anonymous letter that he sent to the Budd household. This letter is really strange and rambling. It concludes with what Fish stated he did with Grace. I've corrected some of the grammatical errors to make it easier to read, and wish to read the letter in full for a specific reason, so keep in mind the theme of the letter and the absence of religious overtones. This will be important later. So Fish wrote, quote, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894 a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering amongst the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Past the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long, he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night, he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten, except head, bones and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 101st Street, rear, right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, bought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I'd already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her though. I could have had I wished. She died a virgin. However, when he was eventually caught, Fish fluctuated between claiming he had not raped Grace and admitting he had done this very thing. It was the note that Fish sent to the Budd family that led to his undoing. This letter had the logo of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association emblazoned on it. The police went to the organization and spoke to a janitor who was determined had owned this stationery, but he stated he'd taken it to his former home, a room at 200 East 52nd Street, and he'd left it there when he moved out. This room had then been rented out to Albert Fish. Police went and waited outside the apartment door and waited for Fish to return. He initially agreed to go willingly, but then pulled out a razor and tried to attack the officers. He was quickly subdued and taken into custody. He quickly confessed to killing Grace Budd and being the author of the note sent to the family many years after her abduction. Fish directed the police back to the property where he'd murdered Grace, and, when looking in the grounds, they recovered her skull, but almost nothing else of her remains. To cement their case further, Edward Budd, Grace's brother, was driven to identify Fish face to face. When Edward saw Fish, he launched himself at him, screaming, quote, "You old bastard, dirty son of a bitch." Fish showed no emotion, which prompted Edward to state, "Don't you know me?" Fish answered politely, quote, "Yes, you're Mr. Budd." It should be noted that Grace Budd's death was the only one that Fish was ever tried for. He confessed to the 2 other crimes later and did not go to trial, likely because of the outcome of the hearings related to Grace's murder. Albert Fish's trial for Grace Budd's murder began on March the 11th, 1935, in White Plains, New York. Fish pleaded not guilty to murder by reason of insanity, claiming that he believed that God had told him to kill Grace. The utter depravity of Fish was laid bare at his trial, as psychiatrists inventoried his personality and identified a long list of sexual proclivities, which included, and it is a long list, sadism, so taking pleasure in other people's pain or humiliation, masochism, taking pleasure in one's own pain or humiliation, paedophilia, necrophilia, sexual arousal from acts involving urine, eating feces, whipping, sexual arousal from a sight of blood, female genital mutilation, cannibalism, arousal from penetrating the skin of himself and others with sharp objects, for example pins and knives, watching others engage in sexual or intimate acts, as well as exhibitionism. An example of the level of deviancy came when an X-ray was shown of Fish's pelvic area, which showed more than 24 needles he'd inserted into his genital area and his perineum, so the bit between the scrotum and the anus, over the years. One of the psychiatrists who assessed Fish stated he was, quote, a psychiatric phenomenon due to the number of sexual abnormalities that he developed. Fish was assessed as having a, quote, psychopathic personality without a psychosis. So this means that he was a psychopath and so had these traits such as a lack of empathy or conscience, but this was not rooted in delusional thinking. From what I know of this case, I tend to agree with this, as some of Fish's actions blow his own defence apart. Specifically, the note I read out, which was sent to Mrs. Budd, made no mention of any religious motivation to his crimes. It was clearly a note with a particular purpose, to gain further sexual gratification from causing distress to others. It should be noted that Fish had done this throughout his life, sending obscene, sexually explicit letters to women who posted classified ads in the papers, with him outlining what he wanted to do to them and what he wanted them to do to him. Whilst I have no doubt that Albert Fish had serious mental health problems, including apparently declaring himself Jesus Christ on one occasion, it's clear that he was in his right mind when he went to the Budd residence and was able to present himself as a genial, inoffensive old man, hence why the family allowed Grace to go off with him. There's no indication, at that point, that he was suffering from a psychotic episode, i.e. a break from reality. However, that is just my take. To counter, the defence tried to highlight Fish's apparent obsession with biblical text and teachings. None of the jurors doubted that Albert Fish was insane, but it appears, as disclosed by one juror later, they thought he should be executed anyway, given the level of his depravity. As a result, Albert Fish was found guilty of the murder of Grace Budd and sentenced to die in the electric chair, nicknamed, quote, Old Sparky. In March 1935, Albert Fish arrived at Sing Sing prison in New York to await his execution. He never showed any remorse for his crimes. At just after 11 p.m. on Thursday the 16th of January 1936, Albert Fish stepped into the death chamber at Sing Sing prison and was strapped to the electric chair. It's rumoured that he helped place the electrodes on his body. How true this is, I'm unsure. Fish's last words were apparently, quote, I don't even know why I'm here. It apparently took 2 jolts of electricity to kill Fish, which led to a rumour that the needles he put in his body had short-circuited the system. There's no evidence this is true. Regardless, the execution was ultimately successful, and Albert Fish died in approximately 3 minutes. His body was buried in the grounds of Sing Sing prison. Albert Fish claimed to have killed over 100 people, but authorities believe he killed closer to 10 children. Regardless, it's apparent that he killed more children than we know about. I've been able to find some information on a couple of the murders he suspects of committing. The first is of Yetta Abramovich. Yetta was born in Russia, and by the time of her death, on May the 14th, 1927, was 12 years old, living with her family in New York. On this date, she was strangled and beaten on the roof of a 5-story apartment house at 1013 Simpson Street. She died later in hospital. I've looked into it, but I cannot find specific information about why Albert Fish is suspected in this case, aside from noting that apparently a tall young man was seen in the area and that he tried to lure children off the street before he met Yetta. However, Fish was 57 at this point, so I'm unsure why he's connected. Also, there was no mutilation, which seems to have been his hallmark. The second murder is that of 16-year-old Mary Ellen O'Connor, who was murdered on February the 15th, 1932, with her mutilated body being found in a wooded area in Far Rockaway in Queens. Albert Fish is suspected, as, at the time of her murder, he had a job painting houses a short distance away. I think it's important to not get swept up in the lore that's created around various serial killers for one quite important reason. Most of them are pathological liars. This is sort of understandable to some extent, as in order to gain access to victims and get away with their crimes, they're often skilled manipulators and have a disturbing ability to deceive others. However, it muddles the waters when trying to get a handle on these people. With regards to Albert Fish, he appears to fit this mould, with him being described as a pathological liar in texts I've read, with him changing elements of his narrative as time progressed. He also claimed to have killed 100 people, which is considered unlikely, and was likely a claim to try and increase his level of notoriety. His case reminds me of that of Otis Sewell, who claimed that between the 1960s and 1980s, he killed 600 people, whilst his accomplice, Henry Lee Lucas, claimed to have killed a further 100 on top of that. They were no doubt killers who ended the lives of many, but many of their claims have been disproven. Also, it's clear that Fish got a sick kick out of causing others disgust, including writing sexually explicit messages to women who saw in the classified ads. Much of what we know about Fish's crimes came from his own confessions, with little evidence to back it up. So how much of it can we believe? In particular, I have some skepticism about his claim of being a cannibal. When you read the notes regarding his consumption of Grace Budd and Billy Gaffney, they seem extremely melodramatic, trying to make an already horrific situation even more salacious. For example, the preamble in his letter to Grace's mother about famine in China is completely unrelated to what he goes on to talk about. Also, parts of his letter were clearly determined to be nonsense. Yes, there have been famines in China, but not one where children under the age of 12 were sold to butchers, and you could walk into these establishments and they'd wheel out the dead body of a child, and you could take pieces of meat from them. Instead, I read that some detectives felt that he was trying to set up a defense of insanity in order to escape the electric chair, which obviously didn't work. His case is also different to that of Issei Sagawa and Richard Chase, where horrific evidence was recovered to corroborate their cannibalistic crimes. It's clear that, as outlined in court, Fish had a sexual arousal to the concept of cannibalism. Whether he followed through with this is ultimately unclear. Potentially there's truth in his confessions, but this is buried under a lattice of lies. Or perhaps these were just the ramblings of an unsound mind. We will never know. However, even discounting the cannibalistic element, it's clear that Albert Fish was an extremely dangerous and predatory paedophile whose whole life was devoted to utter depravity in order for him to get his sexual kicks. Regardless of what he did to these victims' bodies post-mortem, I have little doubt their final moments were horrific, with him using their bodies to live out his fantasies revolving around sex, torture, and pain. Even with this profile, I would agree that he was one of the most vicious child slayers in history. I've no doubt Albert Fish killed many more children than we know about, and his true number of victims will likely never be known. Sidney Cook is a British convicted rapist and suspected serial killer, currently serving a life sentence for horrific crimes against children in the 1970s. However, these offences are just the tip of the iceberg. Cook was a prolific predator who abused children from the 1960s until the 1980s, and was the head of a group of paedophiles known in the press as the Dirty Dozen. These men abducted, raped, and killed male children. Cook is one of the most remorseless, depraved, and disgusting offenders in UK criminal history, who, at the age of 95, is also one of the oldest serving prisoners in Britain. Welcome to Evil Among Us.
Sidney Charles Cook was born on the 18th of April 1927 in Stroud in the county of Gloucestershire. Little is known about Cook's childhood, but he later claimed in court that he was sexually abused as a child. This may have been his way of trying to gain sympathy from the judge and portray himself as a victim, or it may indeed be true,
but it's no excuse for anything that he did as an adult. In August 1945, Cook joined the British Army, but was a terrible soldier, and he was frequently AWOL and served several prison sentences for this. He was eventually kicked out of the army in 1952, spending most of his time either on the run or behind bars, rather than serving king and country. In the early 1960s, Cook found work as a fairground worker, which would enable him to travel around the country, interact with children, and eventually target them without suspicion. Cook specifically manned a test your strength machine, which was popular with young boys keen to show off. When Cook began sexually abusing children is unclear, but in 1961, he was given a £20 fine for molesting a boy in a cinema. Cook's next confirmed victims were two brothers, with the youngest being 10 and the elder one being around 11 or 12. They both came from an abusive household, where there were 9 children in total, with their father being described as an alcoholic, violent bully, and their mother being unable to care for the children. Cook came across the family whilst working at a fairground in 1970, and it appears that this family may also have been from this community, as the offences he committed were across various areas, indicating this family moved around frequently. The youngest boy was abused by Cook for approximately 5 years from the age of 13 years old, being anally raped, as well as being forced to perform oral sex on Cook, whilst also having him engage in this behaviour on him. The older brother was molested at the same time as his sibling for around 4 years and threatened with violence if he didn't comply. On some occasions, the boys would be taken together to an allotment and sexually assaulted by Cook and a friend of his. Remember these offences, as they'll be important later. How many children Cook molested during the 1970s is unclear, as he targeted disadvantaged families and children from backgrounds of abuse where he could easily integrate himself, molest the children, and then, when the fairground moved on, simply up sticks and set up in another area. Cook, like other serial offenders, was able to take advantage of this nomadic lifestyle and is known to have moved around England, both north and south, going between Oxfordshire, London, Kent, Hertfordshire and Tyne and Wear. It appears that Cook would frequently offend with his associates, who also had a sexual attraction to boys, and, as time progressed, the number of people linked to this behaviour increased to the point where there were around 12 paedophiles who would engage in these offences, and they became known as the Dirty Dozen. Sometimes there are more than 12, sometimes less, but there appears to have been a core of dedicated and prolific paedophiles led by Sidney Cook, which included the following monsters. Leslie Bailey, known as Catweasel, due to his staring eyes which resembled the title character of the British children's TV series of the same name, was born on the 21st of June 1953 in Hackney in London. He had below average intelligence and spent the majority of his childhood in care. In 1973, Bailey sexually assaulted and attempted to murder a 7-year-old girl. For some reason, the charges were reduced and he spent just 5 months in a mental hospital. In 1979, Bailey followed a woman into a lift in a block of flats, beat her and anally raped her. He was sent to prison for 5 years for this attack, being released in around 1982. Robert Oliver was born in around 1955. His mother apparently hated the fact that she had a son, and so dressed him up in women's clothing. By the age of 14 years old, Oliver would spend most of his time at arcades, where he'd be taken advantage of by men who would give him money for sex. Lenny Smith was born in Wales on the 23rd of August 1954. He too spent much of his childhood in care and was known to be the victim of sexual violence, but also the instigator of this type of behaviour. He was the victim due to his time working as a male prostitute in London, but he would also pimp out other young men and children. Smith met Robert Oliver in around 1973. However, it's not clear when he met Sidney Cook. In 1977, Smith was sent to prison for a year for gross indecency with a child. Aside from the link between Lenny Smith and Robert Oliver, it's difficult to establish when and how these four men met each other. However, regardless of how they met, between around the late 1970s and the 1980s, these men would take the lead in travelling around the country, abducting young boys off the street or hiring child prostitutes, at which point they'd be drugged, held whilst other paedophiles were gathered, and then gang raped. Due to the lack of DNA evidence back in the 1970s and the early 80s, the nomadic behaviour of these men, and the vulnerability of their victims, the number of children abused by this paedophile ring has never been established. Similarly, we don't know how many children these men murdered. Conservatively, it's believed they gang raped upwards of 50 children, although this is likely to be a significant underestimation. With regards to children they murdered, this figure varies wildly depending on sources, but could be anywhere from 7 to 20. The deaths of only 3 children ever led to any charges against these men, with Cook, the leader of the group, only being convicted of offences related to one of them. On the 1st of June 1984, 7-year-old Mark Tilsley met a man on the street where he lived in Wokingham in Berkshire, who took him to a sweet shop and bought him a bag of sweets. This man was Sidney Cook, and the shopkeeper heard Cook saying that he would pay for Mark to go on the dodgems that night. Cook was working at a local fairground, having set up his test of strength machine there. After finishing his dinner at 5:30, Mark left his home and rode his bike to the fairground. Before he left, his mother told him to be home no later than 7:30, and he said to her, quote, "Don't worry, Mum, I won't be late." These were his last words to her. It appears that by this point, Cook had already set his plan into motion, with him calling Leslie Bailey, and he and Lenny Smith travelled from London to Wokingham to attend a, quote, party that evening. When they got to the funfair, they met Cook, who had lured Mark away from the main site on the promise of buying him sweets. It appears that Mark was becoming scared, and he resisted, and he had to be picked up and forced into the car and driven to Cook's caravan a short distance away. They then met with another paedophile, known only as Oddbod, at the caravan. Once inside, Mark was given a glass of milk laced with muscle relaxant before being raped by all four men. More muscle relaxant was poured down his throat, and he was gang raped again. At some point, it was noticed that Mark was dead, but Cook said he was just unconscious and returned him to the site of the abduction. The other men left, leaving Cook alone with Mark's dead body. Cook then disposed of Mark's remains, likely burying it somewhere known only to him, and, to the present day, he's never revealed where this poor child's remains are. When Mark didn't return home at 7:30, an extensive search was started, but no trace of Mark could be found. Unfortunately, it appears that he was already dead by this point, so before his parents even knew he was missing. Mark's father John passed away in 2005, and his mother Lavinia in 2011, with both parents dying before they could lay their boys to rest. On the 15th of September 1985, 6-year-old Barry Lewis was outside playing with his friends when he left and began to walk the short distance to his home in Walworth, in South London. He never made it home. Barry was abducted by force or lured into a vehicle. It's important to point out at this point that by the early 1980s, the paedophile group led by Cook had attained a flat, although I've read somewhere there might have been two, in the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, East London. The flat I found information about was described as squalid and disgusting, and, whilst people did live there, the main purpose was to have a place where children could be drugged and gang-raped. The lead tenant at the property and the main person who lived there was Lenny Smith. Sidney Cook was living a short distance away in another flat in Hackney. All through the early 1980s, there were sexual attacks on children in the area, likely all committed by members of this group. It's to this address that Barry was likely taken after being abducted. Here he was drugged, stripped, and anally raped by 7 or 8 men, including Sidney Cook, Robert Oliver, Leslie Bailey, and likely Lenny Smith. Barry was left covered in blood by this ordeal and was believed to have been dead. He remained in the flat until the next day, when Bailey was tasked with disposing of the boy's body. As he was driving towards the county of Essex, northeast of London, Barry stirred, and it was clear that he was still alive. Bailey then strangled Barry, and, when it was sure he was dead, dumped his body in a field in Essex, approximately 30 miles from the site of his original abduction. His body was not found until the 5th of December 1985, almost 3 months after his abduction. Jason Swift had an extremely difficult life. He was born in March 1971 in Warwickshire, in the Midlands, as one of 5 siblings. The family lived in poverty, and, due to the level of neglect in the household, Jason and his siblings were taken into care. Jason's short life was characterised by moving from place to place, from care home to care home. He also had learning difficulties, meaning he needed to attend a special school. He was described as being both quiet and withdrawn. Jason was once asked by a psychologist if he had 3 wishes, what would he ask for? He stated, quote, money, a house, and food. By late 1985, aged just 14, Jason was in London and had, for some time, been travelling around the city, going to public toilets where men would take advantage of him and pay him money or give him food in exchange for sexual services. He's also thought to have been a regular visitor to the Kingsmead estate in Hackney, and evidence was later revealed that he appears to have known Lenny Smith and was seen going in and out of his flat dozens of times in the months prior to his murder. The exact date of Jason's death is unknown, but it's believed that he was murdered on the 27th of November 1985. It's also not clear how he ended up in the flat on the Kingsmead estate, whether he was there willingly or had been abducted and taken there. However, what is known is that Sidney Cook had arranged for at least 6, but likely many more men, to pay him £5 to anally rape Jason. This included Cook himself, but also Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and inevitably Lenny Smith. Jason was drugged and raped for hours, and at some point during this ordeal he died, likely by being suffocated, with something being placed over his nose and mouth deliberately. Jason's body was then taken and dumped in a copse near a place called Stapleford Tawney in Essex, approximately 20 miles away from the site of his murder, where it was discovered on the 30th of November 1985 by a farm worker. Although he was killed after Barry Lewis, Jason's body was recovered 5 days beforehand, and the deposition sites were around 10 miles apart. Autopsies on the bodies of both Jason Swift and Barry Lewis show police that both had sustained horrific injuries from being raped by multiple men, showing them not after one man, but a group of men. Also, it was clear around the same time, in the same area, men were offering their services as babysitters in order to gain access to children to rape, and this included Leslie Bailey, Robert Oliver, and Lenny Smith. In January 1986, the police therefore began a task force investigating the offence of this paedophile ring. Over the course of 1986 and 1987, the police interviewed thousands of witnesses and people of interest and compiled thousands of pages of evidence and intelligence. As time progressed, each of the main group members was arrested. Initially, they were detained for various sex offences, and this included Sidney Cook and Lenny Smith, who were both arrested in February 1986, related to the sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy. Whilst in prison on remand for this offence, Cook would boast about raping children and the murder of Jason Swift. He would go into graphic detail about raping and killing boys, with him saying that he killed many of them. The prisoners were so disgusted that they contacted the police to tell them what they'd learnt. In June 1987, Robert Oliver was arrested and charged with abusing children whilst posing as a babysitter. Oliver was questioned about the death of Jason Swift and confessed that he knew him through Cook and Smith, therefore forming the link between them. In July 1987, Leslie Bailey was arrested and soon confessed to being present on the day that Jason died, raping him and being complicit in his death. He named all of the men that were present. This same month, Sidney Cook was confronted with all the evidence whilst in prison, and he admitted raping Jason, but claimed that he'd simply been invited to a, quote, gangbang, organised by someone else, and he was not responsible for his death. He said that Lenny Smith had brought Jason to the property originally. By 1988, enough evidence had been obtained to charge all 4 men with raping and murdering Jason Swift. Unfortunately, by the time of the trial in 1989, charges against Lenny Smith had been dropped due to lack of evidence. It's really unclear why this happened, as there were multiple witnesses who saw Jason going in and out of his property in the months before he died. Bailey and Cook had also admitted he was there and involved, and Cook even said he was the one who brought Jason to the property. As if this wasn't worse enough, after long, quote, legal arguments, the charge of murder was dropped and replaced by one of manslaughter, so acknowledging that Jason had died during the sexual assault on him, but this was not deliberate, and that he'd been suffocated accidentally during this abuse. The men were convicted on this basis. On the 12th of May 1989, the men were sentenced. Sidney Cook was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Robert Oliver was also sentenced to 15 years in prison. The police continued to investigate the abduction, rape and murder of children. In 1990, Leslie Bailey confessed to police that he'd raped and murdered Barry Lewis, and that he'd raped Mark Tilsley, and was therefore involved in the incident which had led to his death. He gave detailed confessions about who was involved in these crimes, as well as outlining multiple other offences committed by the group. He stated there were at least 8 burial sites dotted around the south of England where victims were buried, but was vague with the details, and none of these sites were located. It appears that in May 1991, the police began a series of 64 interviews with Sidney Cook whilst he was in prison. During these interactions, he apparently went into minute detail about raping Barry Lewis, clearly taking great glee in reliving the experience. However, despite Leslie Bailey's confession and Cook's admission, no one else was charged with these murders, which seems absolutely ridiculous to me. What led to this decision was the fact that Leslie Bailey had significant underlying cognitive and emotional issues, and this, coupled with the fact that he was a child rapist, meant he was not considered a credible witness. In addition to this, Cook subsequently withdrew his confession to raping Barry, and there was little other evidence, so there was not enough to charge anyone else with the offences related to Mark and Barry. So Bailey stood alone in the dock when on the 14th of June 1991, he pleaded guilty to murdering and raping Barry Lewis, and on the 22nd of October 1992, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter and rape of Mark Tildesley. Leslie Bailey was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, but I don't have any information about how long he was meant to serve before he could apply for parole. However, it doesn't matter, as Bailey would never see freedom again, and his time in prison was short. On October the 7th, 1993, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Whitemoor, a Category A prison in Cambridgeshire. He'd been murdered, strangled to death by 2 inmates as retribution for his crimes. Before turning to what has become of Sidney Cook, I want to look at the fates of the other men involved in this case. It's clear that Lenny Smith essentially escaped justice for his part in the murders of children. However, he did not ride off into the sunset. A prolific and dangerous sex offender, he was eventually sent to prison for 10 years in 1992 for a string of horrific sex offences against a 6-year-old boy he was babysitting. He was released from prison in June 1999, but requested to be placed in a secure housing block for offenders next to Nottingham Prison. It appears this was a housing block where serious offenders would go to before moving on to another property, but Smith never left there. It seems that the crimes of the Dirty Dozen had been well publicised by this point, and the community was in uproar about any of these men ever seeing freedom again. Smith likely knew that if he stepped out into the real world, he would be murdered. This was a well-founded concern, given that Leslie Bailey had already been murdered, but also a man named Bill Malcolm was murdered in February 2000. He was living in a property in East London when someone knocked on the door. When he opened it, he was shot at point-blank range in the head. Malcolm was an associate of the Dirty Dozen, but I'm unsure exactly what offences he was involved in with them. However, his record is described as appalling in and of itself, and it included him raping a 6-year-old girl. Then, when he was released from prison, tracking her down and raping her again, while saying, quote, "You put me away, you bitch." It's believed this was an organised hit by gangs who felt he deserved to die for his crimes. No one mourned his passing. So Lenny Smith, likely fearing he would suffer the same fate, lived in this property attached to the prison, apparently leaving only once or twice for 7 years until his death from AIDS in 2006. Robert Oliver served his original sentence and was released, apparently changing his name. Due to his crimes, he was required to register as a sex offender and have restrictions about having contact with children, i.e. he shouldn't have any at all ever. In July 2013, he was jailed for 3 years for breaching these conditions, as he'd apparently gone into a household with children and sent a birthday card to a 1-year-old. He was released in 2014 and is apparently still alive, but probably with a new name. So what became of Sidney Cook? Sickeningly, his sentence of 19 years was reduced by the Court of Appeal to 16 years in 1992, as he was able to argue that, due to Leslie Bailey's confessions, he must have been the leader of the group. He was just following. Why this made a difference, I do not know. However, the police knew that he was the ringleader. This meant that Cook would be released in 1998. During his time in prison, Cook showed no remorse and refused to undertake any rehabilitation programs. In fact, he revelled in his offending and was seen as a celebrity by other paedophiles. He would describe in graphic detail how he'd raped and murdered children, claiming he killed between 15 and 20. The public was well aware of how dangerous Cook was, and so, when he was released on the 6th of April 1998, they were waiting for him. Despite changing his name to Sidney Lomas, Cook was easily recognisable, and it was clear that if someone got their hands on him, they would tear him limb from limb. Cook was housed at Yeovil Police Station in Somerset for his own protection and stayed there for 9 months, not leaving the premises. The police knew they had an extremely dangerous child rapist and murderer now released. It was only a matter of time until he began offending. They needed something, anything, to hang on him, to get him off the streets forever. Luckily, they got a break. They were able to obtain statements from the two brothers I mentioned at the beginning of the video, who Cook abused for years in the 1970s. Based on this, on the 20th of April 1999, just over a year after his release, Sidney Cook was charged with 18 sexual offences against these children, including rape and sexual assault. During his police interview, he admitted the offences, and showing his disgusting, distorted thinking, he told the officers that the reason why he'd performed oral sex on one of the boys, after he'd forced this child to do this to him, was because, quote, he gave me entertainment, and I returned the compliment. Sidney Cook was remanded to custody after being arrested, and on the 17th of December 1999, he appeared at Wolverhampton Crown Court before Judge David Poole for sentencing, having pleaded guilty to the offences for which he was charged. Judge Poole stated, quote, "The reports before me are unanimous, that notwithstanding your advancing years, you remain for the time being, and will remain for an incalculable period, a serious danger to children." He then sentenced him. Sidney Cook was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 5 years before he could apply for parole. Sidney Cook has been eligible to apply for parole from around 2004, and at the time of recording, this has been refused 10 times, most recently in October 2021. He was back in the papers again in October 2022, when a story appeared about him making an appeal to get his freedom. Obviously, a story like this produces panic, and I sometimes wonder whether the authors are just ignorant of how things work, or know and just want to be sensationalist. Basically, prisoners on life sentences can apply for parole at regular intervals. This is reviewed by the parole board. This happens maybe once a year or once every 2 years. The parole board can decide to release them back into the world, move them to open conditions, which is a less restrictive environment, or refuse either of these two things. Cook has been denied either release or a move to open prisons since he first became eligible for parole and remains in the Monster Mansion, H&P Wakefield, a cash VA prison which houses some of the country's most dangerous offenders. The fact he still remains in this environment and has not been moved to a lower security prison for his entire time in custody shows what the authorities think of him. Sidney Cook can apply for release until the cows come home, but he'll never be released. And, at the age of 95, he's hopefully coming to the end of his miserable life, and the next headline will be about his death. Sidney Cook is one of the most prolific and remorseless child sex offenders and murderers the UK has ever seen, and that is just what we know. Unfortunately, Cook committed his offences at a time when there were no CCTV cameras, and our understanding of DNA was still in its infancy. He was a calculating and predatory sex offender, travelling the length and breadth of the country abusing children. I've no doubt that he specifically chose working at a fairground, knowing this would attract little boys who he could then abuse before packing up and moving on to a new site quickly without anyone batting an eyelid. His type of victim was not arbitrary either. Cook targeted children he knew had fallen through the cracks in society, like Jason Swift, a lost young man who was already being abused by predatory men when all he wanted was a roof over his head and food in his belly. Sidney Cook is a man who devoted his whole life to the abuse of children. He was inevitably a sexual psychopath. I've no doubt that he got sexual gratification from him and the screams of his victims. He also saw that he could make money from this, and so got men to pay him to rape the children he obtained. The men whom he committed these offences with were no less evil. All of them were deeply disturbed, horrific excuses for human beings. Together, these men, and all of the others involved, formed an unholy alliance, intent on meeting their disgusting sexual need to abuse young boys, destroying their bodies, and for those they did not kill, inflicting wounds so deep psychologically and emotionally that I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people they abused and let live committed suicide afterwards, or struggled with being able to cope in their life until this very day. People who victimise children are cowards, pure and simple, but Cook existed in a world surrounded by pathetic cowards and gained a sense of celebrity from these pathetic sycophants. All through his time in prison, it appears he wanted recognition and praise for the things he had done. I've read that Cook is a remorseless and arrogant man, and imagine that if you sat down with him, he would sit there with a smirk on his face, just asking for a kicking. The most heartbreaking part of this story is just how little we know about the crimes of Cook and the so-called Dirty Dozen. Several men I haven't mentioned were convicted of their part in this paedophile ring, but the majority were never identified and never prosecuted. This lack of knowledge also means the identities of all the children they murdered will never be known. Each one of these victims represents a life that was snatched away before it even begun, but also a family who never knew what happened to their loved one, or, even worse, because of the type of children he targeted, some may never have been reported missing. Their disappearances may not have even been noticed. I hope that all of the children who died at the hands of Sidney Cook and his disgusting band of paedophiles are at peace, and the ones that survived have been able to rebuild their lives despite what these monsters did to them. Javed Iqbal was a Pakistani serial killer, paedophile and child rapist who claimed to have killed 100 boys in a 12-month period between 1998 and 1999. He strangled his victims and then dissolved their bodies in acid. His self-proclaimed kill count makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in history, and whilst there are some doubts about his number of victims, it's clear he ended the lives of many children and was proud of his crimes. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Most sources state that Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore, the second largest city in Pakistan, but other years of birth mentioned include 1961. He was the sixth of 8 children to his businessman father Muhammad, and the family, who observed the Muslim faith, was quite well off. Iqbal showed violent, self-entitled and manipulative behaviour as a child, with one of his brothers stating, quote, "As a boy, he was violent and eccentric. He would give a lot of headache to our parents." Another brother said that if his parents ever refused his demands, he would threaten to hurt himself until he got what he wanted. Iqbal himself said that during his childhood, he first began having fancies about killing people. As a young man, Iqbal was described as arrogant, an individual consumed with his own self-importance, and he would regularly boast about his alleged ties to politicians and other famous people in Pakistan. He was desperate to give people the impression that he was part of high society and therefore better than them. Iqbal knew he was gay from a young age, something his conservative Muslim family refused to acknowledge, but it appears this was a well-known secret. Iqbal's feelings of rejection and anger about not being able to openly indulge his sexual interest in males built up inside of him, and his resentment against society began to fester. Iqbal did marry twice in his life, even having a daughter, but it appears that these marriages were to stop rumours about his behaviour from spreading. However, when he got to his 20s, it became clear that Iqbal was not interested in men, but little boys, and he would go to great lengths in order to find victims. This was a time well before the internet, and people used adverts in magazines and newspapers in order to find people to speak to find pen pals, and Iqbal was one of these individuals. He put adverts in the Altair magazine, specifically stating he wanted to talk to people. It's not clear what his advert specifically said, but it was like they were geared towards ensuring that the majority of those writing to him were children. I believe on one occasion, he said he wanted someone to write to about collecting stamps. Those children who did write to him would receive letters written in colourful pens, clearly to make them more attractive to a child. Iqbal would send money to the children in his letters in exchange for photographs of them, but also asking them to meet him. Whilst it was only a small amount of money, it was likely more than these children had ever seen, and many of them went to his property unaccompanied and were molested by Iqbal. In the neighbourhood where he lived, he quickly gained a reputation as a paedophile, and parents would keep their children as far away from him as possible, but this did not stop Iqbal from luring children from outside of the immediate area. A man who lived in the area said, quote, "It was an open secret. Everyone knew he molested young boys." Iqbal's family received numerous complaints about his paedophilia, but they were able to pay the families off. This seems to have emboldened Iqbal, and he became more brazen. In 1990, he lured a 9-year-old boy off the streets into his home and raped him. The boy's parents called the police and filed a report. He was arrested for sodomy. However, Iqbal was able to pay the police off, and the charge was dropped. Iqbal then opened an arcade in the early 1990s, which was a magnet for local children. He would spoil them, and an adult who used to go there as a child later stated, quote, "He spent lavishly on kids. He would buy us firecrackers. He even built fish aquariums and enclosures for snakes for the entertainment of neighborhood kids." Children would flock to the arcade day and night, and Iqbal took full advantage of his constant stream of victims. He would drop a 100 rupee note on the floor, which is just under £1 or just over $1 in today's money. He would then watch which child picked it up and announce that his money had been stolen. He would then say he needed to search the boys. Once the money had been found on the boy who picked it up, he would be accused of being a thief and told to go with Iqbal into a different room, assumedly for punishment or a talking to. In this room, the boy would be anally raped and often told they could keep the money to buy their silence. Iqbal did this repeatedly. Eventually, word spread amongst the area and parents stopped letting their children go to the arcade. However, Iqbal was undeterred and set up an aquarium, a gym, and even a school, all with the intention of attracting young boys that he could molest. It's clear that Iqbal was a committed paedophile who would use family money to set up ventures to indulge his deviant sexual interest in little boys. Things got worse in 1993 when his father died and Iqbal received a significant amount of inheritance money. Iqbal would spend lavishly, including building a large house in Rana town in 1995, where he would often be seen with young boys who would invite over and no doubt molest. Eventually, Iqbal opened another arcade in order to continue to gain access to young boys and to rape them. In February 1998, a report was received from the police. They'd lured 2 young boys from the Das Darbar shrine in Lahore, taken them to a remote location, and raped them at gunpoint. Iqbal was again able to pay the police off and was not charged. On another occasion, Iqbal raped a child from an upper-class family. The matter was taken to the elders of the area, and Iqbal was forced to write a letter saying he wouldn't do it again. And this note was circulated around the area, and Iqbal was made to visit about 100 local businesses to apologise as penance for his crimes. However, his luck ran out in September 1998, when Iqbal was beaten severely by 2 children, including one who worked at the arcade. Iqbal was beaten so badly that he received severe head injuries and was unconscious for 22 days at Lahore General Hospital. Whilst he was unconscious, a child's family made a complaint of rape to the police, and, due to not being around to try and bribe his way out of it, when he regained consciousness, he was arrested on a charge of sodomy, but bailed. None of Iqbal's family were willing to pay for his medical treatment, so he had to pay for this out of his own pocket, and he lost his expensive house and cars and was essentially penniless. When he was released from hospital, he had weeks of recovery ahead and was unable to walk properly without assistance. He was forced to move into a run-down property in a slum near the Ravi Road in Lahore, and his aging mother took care of him. I found no real information about his mother, but she and Iqbal were apparently close, but she soon died of a heart attack, and Iqbal linked this directly to the stress of the police daring to arrest him for raping children. The death of his mother appears to have been the straw that broke the camel's back, and Javed Iqbal decided to get revenge against society by killing 100 male children. He wanted revenge against the police, who would dare to arrest him for raping children, and so would show how cunning he was by committing murders right under their noses. He wanted children to be punished because they dared to report his behaviour to the police, and also attacked him, despite it being highly likely that those who assaulted him were children he had raped or attempted to rape. However, most of all, he wanted revenge for his mother's death, with him later confessing after his arrest, quote, "My mother cried for me, I wanted 100 mothers to cry for their children. Between approximately December 1998 and December 1999, Javed Iqbal put his sickening plan into action. Javed Iqbal was showed a high level of planning in order to commit the murders. He'd apparently continued to fixate on murder throughout his adulthood and had mentioned to others that he felt he could commit the perfect murder by dissolving the bodies of his victims in acid. So Iqbal bought a number of barrels of hydrochloric acid and stored them in his home, which would also be the place where the children would be murdered. Iqbal also had accomplices. He shared his home with 3 boys: Sajid Ahmad, age 17, Mamad Nadim, age 15, and Mamad Sabir, aged just 13 years old. There was also a 4th accomplice called Mohammed Ishaq, but I cannot find any information on him. These boys were so-called street children, those who were orphaned and had no family, or those whose family were extremely impoverished, so their children would take to the streets to try and make money any way they could. This included selling items on the streets, but a terrible profession that some of these, often very young children, were forced into was giving massages to men, which would inevitably end with sexual contact. Iqbal offered his accomplices money to bring in boys, which enabled them to be able to avoid this type of life, but only by victimizing others. The victims came from this same marginalized and often forgotten part of the population, and, using his accomplices' local knowledge, it was not difficult to find a steady stream of vulnerable children who were lured to Iqbal's apartment. Many of the victims were targeted at the Hira Mandi Bazaar and the Dasa Darbar Shrine, both in Lahore. The children would be lured to Iqbal's property, and, when inside, he would rape them, strangle them with a chain, and then dismember them, with the piece of their body then being dissolved in vats of acid. The remnants of these bodies would then be dumped, likely by being poured down a drain. The youngest victim was 6 years old, the oldest, 16. Iqbal would take the children's clothes and shoes and label them, often using a photo he had taken of the children just prior to his murder. This was his collection of trophies. I've struggled to find information on Iqbal's victims, but I have found information about 2 brothers, although the name of only one is mentioned, and neither's age is documented. One of these brothers escaped with his life, the other tragically did not, and their story gives an idea of how the gang operated to lure children into Iqbal's clutches. In October 1999, Ijaz Muhammad, lovingly known as Kaka by his family, and his older brother went out to try and make money. They were both masseurs and would walk the streets hanging out in parks, clinking together bottles of ointment in the hopes of attracting customers which, as already outlined, would usually be paedophilic men. Kaka's brothers said they were in the park in Lahore when they were approached by 2 boys not much older than them. They told them, quote, "Our boss needs a massage and he'll pay you double the price if you come with us." The brothers followed the pair until they were outside Iqbal's property. Kaka was told to go inside as the boss, Iqbal, was waiting to speak to him. Kaka's brother then left to try and find other customers. Kaka was never seen alive again. How many children Iqbal actually killed is disputed, and I'll return to this later, but regardless of the true number, it's clear that he was a prolific child murderer, and none of his crimes were noticed until he himself confessed, which he actually had to do twice before anyone actually bothered to do anything about it. In November 1999, a letter was received by Lahore police station, which was a confession, with the author stating they had killed 100 boys. A few officers went to the address on the note, Iqbal's home, and knocked on the door. When he answered, he was agitated and abusive, and at one point, pulled out a gun and began threatening the officers, saying he would shoot himself if they didn't leave him alone. So, what did they do in this situation? Did they bundle him to the floor, arrest him, and search the property? No, they simply walked away. In December 1999, Javed Iqbal mailed the same letter, along with dozens of pictures of boys he'd murdered, to the offices of Jang, Pakistan's most popular Urdu language newspaper. This landed on the desk of the editor, Jamal Chisti, who later stated, quote, "After going through the contents of the envelope, I thought there could be two possibilities. Either someone was trying to frame him, or this man has really done it." Jamil and a colleague took it upon themselves to investigate, and they, like the police a month before, went to Iqbal's property. It was abandoned and padlocked. The two journalists scaled an outside wall in order to gain entry. What they found inside was like something out of a nightmare. They saw bloodstains all over the floor and walls, and noticed blood on a chain, the same one used to strangle the victims. There were sacks scattered around the floor, as well as a journal, with placards neatly pinned to the wall explaining what they'd found, like some sick museum exhibit. One placard read, quote, "The 5 sacks lying in one corner of this room contain the clothes of 100 victims, while the remaining 3 contain 85 pairs of shoes belonging to them. All details of the murders are contained in the diary and the 32-page notebook that had been placed in the room. This is my confessional statement." Another read, quote, "I've decided to commit suicide." There was a distinct smell of decomposition, which seemed to be emanating from 2 barrels in the property. One of these was opened and found to contain human body parts which had been dissolved. Later, it would be determined that the barrels contained a human torso, as well as 2 feet amputated at the ankle. They were determined to be the remains of 3 different children who had been dead for some time. A placard on the wall near the barrels stated, quote, "The bodies in this room have deliberately not been disposed of, so that the authorities will find them after my suicide." Also found in the property were bags and bags of human hair, clearly taken from the heads of the victims due to how long this would take to dissolve in acid. This point, and the whole setup, indicates that Iqbal had set up a production line of murder and dismemberment, with him having researched every aspect of how to achieve his horrific objective of killing 100 boys as quickly as possible. It appears that he achieved this in approximately 12 months. Jamil and his colleague began investigating what they'd found. Using the notebook they recovered, they were able to contact the families of children Iqbal had claimed to have murdered, and they were able to establish that these children had indeed disappeared. On December the 3rd, 1999, the story was published on the front page under the headline, quote, "Claim of murder of 100 kids," with 57 pictures of the murdered children being published on the front page, many of them smiling, not knowing about their impending horrific fate. Publication of this story caused understandable chaos, and parents of missing children descended on the area, clutching photographs of their babies. Then, and only then, did the police actually do anything. They recovered the barrels from the property and sent them off for examination. They also collected all the shoes and clothing and laid them out in an evidence room, whilst grieving parents had to pore through these piles, looking for items belonging to their children. Absolutely horrific. The police then began looking for Iqbal and his accomplices. His 4 accomplices were found first, having been arrested when they tried to cash a stolen traveller's check. However, whilst in custody, one of these, Mohammed Ishaq, apparently committed suicide by jumping out of a window whilst being questioned. From what I've read, suspects of particularly heinous crimes having accidents or committing suicide were quite common in this part of the world at this time, and was a poor attempt at a cover-up when these people were murdered or assisted out of the window by being thrown. Iqbal was nowhere to be found, but the police didn't have to look for him for long. On the 30th of December 1999, Javed Iqbal walked into the newspaper office of Jang and gave himself up. At the time, legal proceedings in Pakistan were usually held behind closed doors, but the court case against Javed Iqbal and his accomplices was widely covered by the cameras. Despite his confession, it's clear that Iqbal wanted things on his terms. He wanted attention and praise for what he'd done, but he didn't want to suffer the consequences of his actions, and so, despite writing a 30-plus page confession and leaving signs above all of the evidence, he claimed he was innocent of the offences. His claims were laughable. On one occasion, he said his confession about killing 100 boys was simply to bring attention to the plight of Pakistan's impoverished child population. Seriously? I mean, I don't even know where to start with that one. He also claimed that despite the remains found in the barrels in his home being identified as human bodies, the dismembered remains of children, he claimed they were simply full of beef and other meat as a way to confuse the police. Iqbal made long, rambling statements in court which made little sense, including him saying, quote, "I was considered an insane person, but I beg that my viewpoint must also be heard. I considered myself a culprit because I have been made a culprit by police." So I think what he's saying here is that he confessed the crimes because the police told him he was the one responsible. Right. Inevitably, Iqbal and his accomplices were found guilty, and on March the 16th, 2000, stood to be sentenced before Judge Ranja. 13-year-old Mahmad Sabir was sentenced to 63 years in prison. 15-year-old Mahmad Nadim was sentenced to 182 years in prison. 17-year-old Sajid Ahmad was sentenced to death by hanging. As for Javid Iqbal, he was sentenced to death and then some. The judge ordered that he be strangled publicly in the street in front of the families of his victims. His body would then be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid, exactly the way he had murdered so many children. However, despite this sentence being, in my opinion, quite fitting, it quickly caused an uproar amongst human rights activists and was appealed. It was determined that this sentence was abhorrent and could not be carried out. So, a new sentence date was set for the middle of October 2001, but Javid Iqbal would never attend this. On October the 9th, 2001, both individuals sentenced to death, Javid Iqbal and Sajid Ahmad, were found dead in their respective cells in prison. The official report was that they died by poisoning themselves. However, autopsies of both found they had clear signs of strangulation and a pattern of injuries suggesting they'd both been beaten at the time of their deaths and in the weeks and months before. I think it's pretty clear that the prison guards or prisoners, or both, took matters into their own hands with this one, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. Before talking about the profile of Javid Iqbal, an important issue is why he was able to get away with this for so long. Iqbal's crimes only came to light when he confessed. He claimed that he could have killed 500 if he wanted to. I think this is true. The police just didn't care. Why is that? Central to this is the inefficiency and corruption in the police, which had an impact on them actually bothering to investigate anything, the parents of the murdered children even feeling they were able to report their loved ones missing. The reason for this, from my research, was the rampant corruption and extortion happening in the police. Victims' families were scared to go to the authorities, for fear they would be shaken down and what little they had taken from them. They also knew that nothing would be done. As they came from poor families, their problems simply didn't matter. This is why only 25 of the 100 children who went missing were ever reported to the police. This is absolutely disgusting, and I pray that the police in Pakistan have changed significantly in the 20+ years since this horrific case. Before getting to Javid Iqbal's psychology, I want to play a very, very short clip of one of his ramblings, which I think was made to a journalist during an interview.
ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा फांसी खुदा तो मेरी हस्ती को भी नबूस कर देता अगर खुदा एक आदमी, दो आदमी, 3 आदमी, 10 आदमी, 15 आदमी, 20 आदमी खुदा का नाम।
Getting tired of the number of cases I've come across where religion is brought into it. It's either the devil made me do it, or God commanded me to do it. Or, in this case, well, if I was doing anything wrong, God would have stopped me. These are all examples of distancing language, shifting the responsibility of what they have done to someone or something else, allowing them to continue to diminish responsibility for their actions. It's clear that by the time that he appeared in court, Iqbal was panicking. I think he was so disconnected from reality that he believed he was justified in what he was doing, and that, When he announced his killing spree, people would fall in a pile on the floor, worship him as a god, and he would walk through the streets feared. He'd stuck his middle finger up at society, and he expected society to simply back down, having learnt their lesson, don't mess with Javid Iqbal, and then continued on his merry way, like he's continuing to rape and murder children. I imagine he had fancies of newspaper interviews, television appearances, where the focus would be on him and his accomplishments, with people fascinated by his genius and the fact that he'd fought back against oppression. That is the only reason why he confessed, to get this recognition, and why he contacted the media and surrendered himself to them. However, when reality hit home and he realised, hey, people are pretty pissed, he scrambled around looking for some way to wriggle out of this airtight coffin he'd created for himself. And this included claiming that he'd faked everything to send some sort of powerful message to raise awareness about the plight of impoverished children. That one I find particularly pathetic. Iqbal's mindset and his offending shows profound narcissism and psychopathic personality. He genuinely appeared to think that he was above everyone else and that he should be allowed to rape as many children as he wanted. How dare the police try to stop him? If they arrested him, it was not because he had violated the bodies and minds of these children, it was because no one recognised the genius of him. These children were merely objects for him to use and abuse, to gain sexual gratification, but then to murder in order to get its own back at society that had tried to stop his sick sexual behaviour. How many children Javid Iqbal killed is unclear. It seems as though some of the children he claimed to have murdered were later found safe and well, but this only accounted for around 4 or 5 of them. Also, around 20 to 30 of the victims have never been identified from their photos, which is heartbreaking, as these were likely children who had no one, and so, when they died, there was no one to even notice or search for them. However, around 70 of the children in the pictures were identified, and they have never returned home. So the actual total is likely to be somewhere between 70 to 90 plus, which is just a staggering and horrific total, which makes Javid Iqbal one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. As with other men who consider themselves to be superior, akin to gods, Javid Iqbal was a coward who targeted the most vulnerable in society. I'm not advocating for death to anyone, but I for one do not mourn his passing or have particular negative emotions about the manner of his death. On February the 20th, 2015, Avon and Somerset Police in the UK received a phone call from the family of Becky Watts, who was just 16, saying that she'd gone missing. Within hours, an intense search was started, and desperate appeals were made by her family for information. However, by this point, she was already dead, having been murdered by her stepbrother, Nathan Matthews, a paedophile who had a fixation on petite teenage girls. As if killing her was not bad enough, she'd been dismembered, and the police captured him buying the circular saw he used for this sickening task. But he was not alone in his crimes. He was helped by his girlfriend, Shauna Hoare. This evil couple thought they were very clever and had gotten away with murder, but their lies were quickly uncovered, and their sickening crime and their pathetic attempts to manipulate the police were laid bare. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Rebecca Marie Watts, known as Becky, was born on the 3rd of June 1998 in Bristol, a city in southwest England. It doesn't seem like she had the easiest start in life, with her parents splitting up before she was born, and she spent the first few years of her life living with her mother, Tanya Watts. Becky was taken into care aged 3 due to concerns about neglect, before living with her father, Darren Galsworthy, and his partner, a woman called Angie Matthews, who had a son from a previous relationship, Nathan Matthews. Becky had delayed speech and didn't talk properly until she was around 3.5 years old, and tragically, her first proper word was apparently Nathan. Angie said that, although Becky was her stepdaughter, they were inseparable, and she loved her, and raised her as though she was her own biological daughter. Becky also had a close relationship with her biological mother, Tanya, despite not living with her, and they would see each other regularly. However, a lack of support during her vital early years meant that Becky struggled with various issues throughout her short life, including anxiety and self-confidence. Becky went to Summerhill Junior School, where her teachers remembered her as a quiet but happy pupil, with one teacher saying, quote, "She was incredibly shy and incredibly quiet, but by the end of year 5, she started to come out of herself. However, it was when Becky moved to secondary school at the age of 11 that she began to have difficulties. She was bullied, and comments were specifically made about her weight. This shattered Becky's already fragile self-esteem. When she was 13 years old, Angie called the local Children and Young People services and asked for help, as Becky was refusing to go to school. Various professionals engaged with Becky. She was showing a high level of defiance and aggression when challenged. It was clear this was a defense mechanism, as she developed a significant fear of people and places, and tragically, she was particularly terrified about being abducted, as she'd scared herself reading various stories on the internet. Becky also developed anorexia, and her issues meant that she was referred to a child psychologist and an eating disorder clinic to try and help her. In addition, Becky began engaging with the Hospital Education Service, a specialist service providing education for children who have mental or physical health issues, which mean they're unable to attend mainstream school. The combination of a new school environment and therapy meant that Becky started to get better. She was coping better when attending her classes, began to develop friendships, and began doing things that teenage girls did, like going out shopping with her friends and going to sleepovers. However, when she was 14 years old, concerns were raised again when Becky told teachers that she was being pressured into sending indecent images of herself to other boys, and they also wanted her to send explicit text messages. Becky was referred to services to provide support to children at risk of sexual exploitation. Unfortunately, whilst the focus of professionals was on protecting Becky from predatory males in the world, the most dangerous person in her life was someone she knew well, someone she called her stepbrother, Nathan Matthews, a disturbed and predatory paedophile who, rather than protecting her, would end her life. I usually refer to the offenders in my videos by their last name, but as one of their last names is Hoare, using this might distract from what I'm saying, so I'll just use their first names on this occasion. So, Nathan Charles Matthews was born on the 9th of January 1987 in Bristol to his mother Angie. He never knew his father. At around the age of 7 years old, Nathan went to live with his grandparents. Why he moved there is unclear, but it seems he had regular contact with his mother, and then eventually Becky Watts' father, Darren Galsworthy, when the pair began their relationship. His early years seem unremarkable. There may have been early warning signs suggesting the monster he'd become, but none of these are documented. As a teenager, Nathan joined an army cadet attachment at Cadbury Heath in Bristol. He seemed to enjoy this and was seen as a model cadet. During this time, he was given weapons training, but also, importantly for later, was taught how to deal with spillages, including using a product similar to cat litter to absorb liquid, but also cover up odour. Nathan went on to study electrical engineering at the City of Bristol College, before, at the age of 18 years old, joining the Royal Logistics Corps, Army Reserves, training at the Maindee Barracks, Cardiff, so basically he was a part-time soldier. It was at this point where warning signs appear to have been noted. Nathan was described as a good soldier, but was also known to be, quote, stroppy, with a fellow squaddy stating, quote, he had a bit of an anger problem at times. He would sometimes snap in frustration and throw things in temper sometimes. It's also important to point out at this point that since he was a child, Nathan suffered from a rheumatic condition known as fibromyalgia, a chronic illness that causes pain and tenderness throughout the body. The severity of this condition varies from person to person, but in Nathan's case, it was sometimes severe and he would often be debilitated by pain. So it seems likely that Nathan was a man plagued by feelings of inadequacy and shame due to his height, with him being only 5'5", and his physical health issues. It seems that Nathan was a petulant, immature man who expected others to do what he said. He wanted to be in control of situations and people, as a way to feel powerful to offset the deep, dark hole of insecurity inside of him. As he got older, Nathan's behaviour in the family home also began to deteriorate. Initially, he and Becky appeared close, but he began to resent her. He was jealous of how close she was with Angie, and he looked for any opportunity to destroy her self-esteem. This included calling her fat, knowing full well that she was battling anorexia. The pair would have frequent arguments, and this included Nathan chasing Becky upstairs, shouting that he would kill her. Becky once told a psychologist that she was afraid of Nathan. However, it was what Nathan was doing in his private life which gives a window into his twisted mind. So from around his mid-teens, Nathan developed an obsession with pornography and would spend hours at a time watching porn on his computer. He had a particular obsession with videos and pictures showing violent sex with females, and especially while they were restrained in some way. Evidence later showed they'd been watching videos where the scenario was men breaking into homes, tying up and raping the female occupants. He was also particularly fixated on legal pornography, which fits under the umbrella of, quote, teen, where you have an adult actress clearly made to look younger than she is, so that some viewers can fantasize that she's a child while not getting into trouble for possessing this material. Despite his overt conflict with Becky, it's clear that he was also sexually attracted to her from a young age. It was later disclosed that he'd rubbed Becky's inner thigh in a sexual way when she was 8 years old, and he was around 20, and he'd apparently done this to two of her friends who were the same age. It's apparent that Nathan had fancies about controlling women and little girls, sexually violating them in order to take what he wanted and dominate them, and that extended to how he would act towards his partners. In around 2006, Nathan, then aged around 19 years old, began a relationship with a woman known only as KJ. She later reported to the police that Nathan was controlling and abusive in the relationship, demanding sex whenever he wanted, as well as controlling who she saw and what she did. He would always either need to be with her or in constant contact with her, questioning her on what she was up to. KJ managed to escape the relationship. I do not know how old KJ was, but it seems that she may have been an adult, or at least over the age of consent in the UK, which is 16. However, after KJ left him, it appears that Nathan began looking for teenage girls to start relationships with, and he was looking for those who were particularly vulnerable. No doubt he was doing this because he was sexually attracted to teenage girls, but he also thought it would be easier to control a child. In 2008, he met 14-year-old Shauna Hoare. Shauna Stacey Charmaine Hoare was born on the 12th of February 1994 in Bristol. Her childhood was extremely dysfunctional. Her father left the family home when she was very young, and her mother, Lisa Donovan, remarried soon afterwards. Before the age of 5, Shauna was taken into care due to concerns about neglect, emotional and physical abuse within the home. She was one of 8 children her mother had with 3 different men. Shauna moved from foster home to foster home, never settling in one place for very long. Eventually, Shauna returned to live with Lisa at home in Bristol when she was 13 years old. I don't have the information about what Shauna saw or experienced in foster care, but I imagine that this and her early years at home led to her becoming an extremely damaged child. By the age of 13 years old, she was smoking, drinking, and it appears sexually active, being preyed upon by older men. During this same year, the police received a report that she'd been raped on her way to school, but she refused to give a statement, so no one was arrested. Just a year later, when Shauna was 14, she met Nathan Matthews. How or where is unclear. Shauna's mother, Lisa, later recalled meeting Nathan, stating that he was, quote, controlling and flirty with everyone, sexually orientated, very overpowering. And this apparently included rubbing up against one of her other daughters, who was also a teenager. Unfortunately, this gives an insight into the environment and people which shaped Shauna. She was underage and brought a man round to the house who was around 21 years old at the time, and her mother apparently didn't bat an eyelid. Nathan told his mother and stepfather that Shauna was 16 years old, and despite any reservations they may have had, they tried to make Shauna feel welcome. She became part of the family, to the point where she was registered as Angie's carer due to her having multiple sclerosis. And when she and Darren got married in 2013, she was a bridesmaid, and this picture is truly horrifying, knowing that one of the people in this photograph would be dead less than 2 years after it was taken, and 2 others would utterly destroy the trust placed in them by Darren and Angie and tear the family apart. In order to fully understand the murder of Becky Watts and what happened afterwards, I need to explain the relationship between Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hoare, which began in 2008 and continued for around the next 7 years until their arrest. It was a complicated relationship, which, in my opinion, was characterised by a shifting dynamic that began with obvious one-sided abuse, but then devolved into something even more horrific. I want to be clear that by highlighting trauma in the backgrounds of the offenders in my videos, I'm not condoning their actions. I merely provide this information to help understand the people they were. Trust me, whilst I might empathise with the trauma in their lives, I've absolutely no sympathy for the crimes they commit. With that being said, it's clear that Nathan was abusive and controlling towards Shauna. She was not allowed to buy cigarettes and other items for herself, and had to ask him. When he would buy her things, he would expect her gratitude to be paid with sexual favours. Nathan would also demean Shauna, saying she was, quote, too fat and needed to lose weight. He directed what she could eat and when. He would also abuse her in front of other people, including one time when Nathan told her to, quote, shut the fuck up, you twat, when she tried to speak up about something. During the trial, one of Shauna's friends described Nathan severing the link between them and him making it very difficult for her to see her friends. If she did end up going out to see people, he would demand to always be there, and if it involved a drive, Nathan would demand that the person they were going to visit send him money to pay for petrol. Shauna later described the relationship as follows, quote, I basically spent almost 6 years joined to him. One way or another, it was like I was going to be stuck like this forever, never able to go out, do anything. When she was 16, Nathan gave Shauna permission to go to college, where she wanted to study childcare, but he quickly changed his mind and forbid her from going due to his jealousy about her even speaking to other men. He and Shauna began living together from around 2010. Neither worked consistently and so relied on benefits, and their home, as shown later, was in a state of squalor. Behind closed doors, Nathan was also violent and frequently beat Shauna, with the most serious incident, which has echoes of his later behaviour, involving him grabbing Shauna by the hair and then strangling her for several seconds. If Shauna tried to leave the relationship, Nathan would pull out every trick in the book to regain control over her, including trying to gain sympathy by self-harming. On one occasion, when she ended the relationship, Nathan stabbed himself with a fork and violently scratched his own face. As Shauna grew up, Nathan appears to have lost sexual interest in her and looked for other ways to get his kicks. One way was to ask Shauna to organise a threesome with one of her young-looking friends, which happened several times, with him filming this. However, he'd also tell Shauna about his fancies about abducting and raping teenage girls. Text messages recovered after both of their arrests show the sickening fancies that both appeared to have, with Shauna apparently encouraging Nathan and even trying to procure him potential victims. In November 2014, just months before Becky's murder, Nathan was working as a takeaway delivery driver when he delivered a takeaway to a 16-year-old girl's house. Obviously, due to having an order, he knew her name and began searching for her on Facebook. Messages show that Nathan gave Shauna her name and asked her to message the girl, which she did, apparently to try and convince her to come round so that Nathan could have sex with her. Whether she responded is not entirely clear, but on the 2nd of January 2015, Nathan sent the following message to Shauna saying, quote, she came into the shop, but didn't speak to me. I didn't say anything to her either, as I was talking to a man. Laugh out loud, awkward. Police recovered a series of much more disturbing messages from the 9th of December 2014, which began with Nathan saying to Shauna, quote, fuck you, bring me back 2 pretty schoolgirls then. Shauna replied, laugh out loud, yeah, I'll just kidnap them from school. Later that day, Shauna sent Nathan a message saying, quote, just went to cost cutter and saw a very pretty petite girl, almost knocked her out to bring home, laugh out loud. Less than a minute later, Nathan wrote, don't you almost me, now fucking do it, bitch. Shauna said, laugh my fucking ass off, yeah? I'll just go back in time to when I saw her, time travel with her to our attic, laugh out loud. Police were able to track down both children and establish they'd not been harmed, but it became clear the resemblance that both girls had to Becky, and, generally, from the contents of his computer, it was apparent that Nathan was fixated with children who looked just like his stepsister. Living in squalid conditions, barely working, whilst watching pornography together and discussing Nathan's sexual fantasies, the topic of Becky inevitably came up repeatedly. Shauna would later state in court that Nathan said he, quote, hated Becky. I think there are 2 reasons for this, compared to the bullshit he came up with in court. Firstly, her lifestyle. He was a man who demanded nothing, living in a shit tip. But Becky, the intruder in the family, was a beautiful 16-year-old girl with her life ahead of her, who was starting to overcome her difficulties and live her life. But I think he also hated that he could not have her. She was his sexual obsession, and not being able to have her was driving him crazy. So by early 2015, he devised a plan to take what he wanted by kidnapping and raping her and depriving Becky of the life he felt that he deserved by killing her. Shauna was inevitably a victim in this relationship when she was a child, the girl in the hands of a predatory, manipulative paedophile who ground her down, who spent significant efforts moulding her into the woman that she became. I think the repeated exposure to the sick, depraved man that Nathan Matthews is led to Shauna, who was already a very troubled person, developing horrific, distorted attitudes and beliefs, which meant that she shared his delusions that abducting, raping, and killing children was acceptable, and, like him, probably found these fantasies sexually arousing. This is known as a folie à deux, and is something seen in other killer couples. However, regardless of whatever control and influence Nathan had over Shauna, I firmly believe that he simply built on something that was fundamentally missing within her all along, including a lack of conscience and a lack of empathy for others. I think this is shown by her cold and cat-fainted behaviour after the murder. I think looking a bit deeper into her background, you begin to see her own twisted behaviour before she'd even met Nathan. Specifically, people who knew Shauna when she was a child state that she was a compulsive liar. She would pretend to be pregnant and have cancer in order to gain attention. She was fully willing to manipulate others in her own right. I think one point which would likely guarantee any sympathy for Shauna is lost, and further epitomise the selfishness and horrific nature of the pair, is the fact that these two had a child together, a daughter. They themselves were parents. This is detail that doesn't appear in almost any newspaper article, but is confirmed by a serious case review that I've read, and Shauna herself in one of her police interviews. This child was born towards the end of 2012. I've got no other information, but even this speaks volumes. Despite being a mother herself, the parent of a female child, she was willing to help her partner rape and murder the child of another mother. Same logic applies to Nathan. It's clear they both didn't give a shit about this child, risking their daughter growing up without a mother or a father just so Nathan could get his kicks. So regardless of whether Shauna was a victim once upon a time, by the point of the murder she was a willing accomplice, a mother who decided that her and her partner's fantasies of raping and killing someone else's child were justified. The date chosen to abduct, rape and kill Becky Watts was the 19th of February 2015, and it's clear this date was chosen for a reason. Becky's father Darren would not be home, and Angie had a hospital appointment. Becky would be alone in the house. By this point, Nathan put together what was described in court as a, quote, kidnap kit. This included a large bag, stun guns, handcuffs, face masks, and duct tape. With everything in place, this evil pair put their plan into action. What happened to Becky Watts and the timeline can be established from various sources, including eyewitness testimony, police investigation, and even the statements of Nathan Matthews when he wasn't lying, which was rarely. What we do know is on the 19th of February 2015, Becky's father Darren Galsworthy was at work, and her stepmother, Angie Matthews, was picked up to go to a hospital appointment at around 10:30 a.m, leaving Becky in the house alone, with her being sat in her bedroom, texting her friends and her boyfriend. At 10:50 a.m, Nathan and Shauna left their home at 14 Cotton Mill Lane and drove towards 18 Crown Hill, Bristol, Becky's home address. This journey would only have taken 10 minutes, but they stopped at a local Tesco's to buy batteries for the stun guns. In the vehicle, strapped into her car seat, was the pair's daughter, who would have been around 2 years old at this point. Becky sent her final text message at 11:07, and it's assumed that Nathan and Shauna arrived soon afterwards. It's known that entry was gained to the house with a key that was left hidden outside for emergencies, and, by his later confession, Nathan put a mask on and went upstairs to Becky's bedroom. Whether Shauna also went up to the bedroom at this point is unclear. Nathan went into Becky's room and attacked her. Becky fought for her life ferociously, and her post-mortem showed that she had 40 bruises on her body from her attempts to fend off Nathan. He wrapped tape around her head and eventually placed his hand over Becky's mouth and nose, restricting her breathing until she suffocated to death. I imagine that, narcissist than he is, Nathan imagined walking into Becky's room using his army trainings to subdue her and then forcing her into the large bag he'd brought with him and taking her away to a separate location, no doubt to rape and eventually kill her. But he was as weak as piss and no doubt overestimates his prowess and had to fight Becky every inch of the way. Now dead, Nathan put Becky's body in the bag, then was taken out of the house. In court, it was argued that, due to Nathan's physical health issues, he would have likely been unable to carry Becky's body without some sort of assistance. Therefore, it's apparent based on this that Shauna helped move Becky's body out of the house and likely helped him put her in the bag in the first place. The bag containing Becky's body was placed in the car boot, and at 12:45 p.m, when Angie returned from the hospital, she found Nathan, Shauna, and her granddaughter in the property watching TV. A few hours later, Darren came home from work. Neither Angie or Darren had any idea that in order to get into the house, they'd walked within feet of Becky's body hidden in the car. Eventually, at around 7 p.m, Nathan and Shauna made their excuses and drove back home, taking Becky's body with them. When they got back to their own property, Becky's body was placed in the bath, and Nathan then stabbed her 19 times with a knife and also stabbed her in the neck with a screwdriver. No doubt this was him taking out his anger on her, that his plan had not worked, and she had fought back. How dare she not give him what he wanted? Becky's body remained in the bath overnight, and just after midday on the 20th of February 2015, Nathan was caught on CCTV buying a power saw, the tool he would use to dismember Becky. He then set about this gruesome task. In court, Nathan would claim when he did this, he, quote, closed my eyes, had the saw in one hand, with him implying that he was so disgusted with his actions that he could not bear to look and basically dismembered Becky blind. However, the prosecution noted that there was no damage to the bathtub itself. Nathan was fully in control and methodically cut up the body of his 16-year-old stepsister. That same day, Shauna made searches online, including going on YouTube and typing, quote, "Do you want to hide a body?" Sickeningly, what she was looking for was a spoof video of the song "Do You Want to Build a Snowman" from the film Frozen, which depicts two girls acting out a scene where they place a body inside a rucksack and sing lyrics such as, quote, "Will you help me hide a body? It doesn't have to be in one piece." So these two pieces of shit, whilst the dead body of a 16-year-old child was lying in their flat, were listening to a comedy parody song. This detail shows the absolute lack of remorse of this pair. They were no doubt exhilarated by what they had done, and like typical psychopaths, they obviously thought they were very clever and could easily get away with this. Becky's body was cut into 8 pieces, and her head, left arm, right hand, left hand, right leg and torso were all wrapped separately, being bound tightly in cling film, duct tape and parcel tape. Some of the parts were covered in table salt or cat litter in order to absorb any fluids and reduce the smell of decomposition. Becky's body was then placed inside 3 suitcases. On both February the 21st and February the 22nd, 2015, Nathan and Shauna were seen going to various shops, buying cleaning products to try and cover up the crime scene. Whilst Becky Watts was murdered on the 19th of February 2015, it wasn't until the 20th of February that she was reported missing to the police. This was apparently because her family assumed that she'd gone out on the 19th and then had simply decided to stay over at a friend's house. However, on the 20th of February 2015, Becky's boyfriend and her friends went to her house and said they were concerned. So it wasn't until 4 p.m. on the 20th of February 2015 that the police were called. They began the investigation immediately, and it soon became clear the circumstances of Becky's disappearance were suspicious, as she hadn't got any money with her, no change of clothes, and she hadn't told anyone where she was going. The police began searching the local area, including going house to house and searching open areas, including a local nature reserve. They took to social media, looking for information using the hashtag #FindBecky. On the 23rd of February 2015, Becky's father and stepmother, Darren and Angie, made an appeal for information about her disappearance, as shown by this clip.
She's your typical teenage girl. Lots of selfies, music, fashion.
Becky's father and stepmother told me today that her disappearance is completely out of character, and they are desperate for news.
Bex, if you can see this, get in contact. And if anyone out there knows something, just tell us. Just bring her home safe. If you've got her, then put her somewhere we can find her. We want her home, please.
She's not in trouble. She's just wanted here. We just want her back. That's all we want.
This clip is haunting, not only because, by this point, Becky was already dead and had been dismembered, but also because her son killed his daughter. Police quickly became interested in Nathan and Shauna, as they had been in the house around the time that Becky went missing. Initially, they were considered witnesses, and the police first contacted them on the 23rd of February 2015 to come in for interview. Alarm bells started ringing when both seemed not particularly bothered about prioritising trying to find Becky, with them stating they were too busy to come in. What the police later found out was that Nathan and Shauna were playing for time, as they knew the police were circling and they needed to get rid of Becky's dismembered body, which was still in their flat. So, on the evening of the 23rd of February 2015, Nathan called a friend of his, 29-year-old Carl Demetrius, and said that he would pay him to move and store the suitcases and other items at his home address. The sum promised was around £10,000. Carl then contacted a friend of his, 23-year-old James Ireland, who was promised around half the money to help Carl load the items in a van at Nathan's property and then unload them at the other end. Both of them travelled to Nathan's address, loaded up Becky's body parts in the van, and then drove back to 9 Barton Court, a property just 80 metres away. This was the property of Carl and his 23-year-old partner J. Dean Parsons, and the suitcases containing Becky's body parts were then hidden in their garden shed. In addition, items used in the initial crime, the dismemberment, and the clean-up were also hidden here. All three would later claim they had no idea what was in the suitcases and was simply focused on the money they had been promised, and, when pushed, said they thought it might have been drugs in the suitcases. With Becky's remains now out of the way, suddenly Nathan and Shauna made themselves available to the police, and they were interviewed twice, on the 26th of February and the 27th of February 2015. Both were cocky, confident, and especially related to Nathan, seemed amused by the whole situation, with him smirking during questioning and complaining about his back hurting and how being questioned was hurting his little brain. I'm going to show 2 clips. The first is part of the first interview with Shauna on the 26th of February 2015, which I've had to cut up because the sound goes completely haywire towards the end. The second clip shows part of her second interview the next day.
I think we got there about 11ish. The door was locked, so obviously we used a key from underneath the recycling bin. Got in, heard music upstairs, assumed Becky had been in then. I went into the kitchen to get a cigarette and went to go outside to have a cigarette. My daughter started whinging because she wanted to come out with me, so I took her down to the garden to help feed the rabbit while I had a cigarette. Probably was about 15-20 minutes. Then we came back up. I went into the kitchen to get a drink, I think I was, and wash my hands. Then I heard the front door slam. Carried on washing my hands, went into the living room. And then I think it wasn't until a lot later on that Angie asked me if Becky had gone out. And I said, yeah, I heard the door go. She must have gone out earlier. Washing my hands, I think I heard the door slam, front door. Again, I didn't look at the time or think anything of it, so I didn't really kind of like, oh, what was that? It was just the door, so Becky would have gone out.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I think I've accidentally got this in the wrong order here.
Okay.
You have to clarify this. So, right, let me just go back slightly then, if I could. The door slamming then. You've already said you got to go from the kitchen through to the living room.
Yep.
So, how far away from that front door would you be?
But you've got the front door, the living room, and about halfway up the hallway is the kitchen. So I would have been at the sink. So no distance, a reasonable amount, I'd say.
Okay. And immediately before this sound of the door slamming, what could you hear then?
I think it was just CBeebies again, to be honest. I was kind of more, you know, trying to make sure I had vitamins back and getting my drink.
Yeah.
No, I heard stomping down the stairs. That's what made me think that Becky had left in a mood. So I said to Angie, because obviously the door slammed, but I wasn't sure if that was the wind. I took it because there was like quite stomp, stomp, stomp down the stairs. I assumed, you know, she was in a bit of one of her tantrums.
Yeah. And then the only other thing was just a minor thing really, but I think some of our colleagues were trying to speak to Nathan, just effectively part of those initial inquiries just a few days ago on Tuesday, I think it was, and they sort of perceived a bit of reluctance. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Not to my knowledge, man. I wouldn't know, no.
No. Has Nathan had any sort of concerns about speaking to us?
Not that he's told me, no.
No. Okay.
If he does, I wouldn't know then.
Yeah. How is he finding it?
He's found it quite hard, actually. Again, he's kind of more thinking, my God, if it was...
Yeah.
Or again, knowing how hard it'd be for his mum at the moment. You know, because Becky was almost like a daughter to her.
Yeah.
You know, when it is.
And then over the weekend, have either you or Nathan been involved in searching for Becky or doing any?
No, I wasn't aware they were doing a search. I didn't realise until I think it was yesterday.
Yeah.
I went on my Facebook and obviously there was news articles and pictures popped up about that they did the search, but we weren't told about it at all.
Well, that's fine. Okay, so
Yeah.
to Nathan, that's actually a good thing. Where did you guys go then over the weekend? I don't know if you're able to remember that far back.
Well, the weekend that Becky, like after
So
Becky...
after Becky went missing, I think if I help you, so I think it was on Monday actually that you spoke to police officers, like detectives.
Which would have been outside my mum's house.
That's right.
So I would have went to my mum's that day.
So that was on Monday.
I think I went over on Tuesday.
Where did you stay on Monday night? Do you remember?
It would have been at my house, but we didn't leave until about midnight, to be honest.
You left about midnight
Yeah,
Monday.
most nights we did. Tuesday we went over again.
Yeah.
Again, probably would have left about midnight.
Yeah.
Wednesday, I think we stayed in my house. We might have gone over again Wednesday, actually, sorry, I think. Thursday, which was yesterday.
That was yesterday.
Yeah, we had the interview, and then obviously we've gone over again today.
Yeah,
because Wednesday we started watching a film or two films that my mum's fell asleep and we didn't leave until like 2 o'clock in the morning or something.
On Wednesday.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Thursday, yeah.
And then Thursday we obviously had the interview, and then today.
I'm sure you picked up on a few things. The complete lack of any emotion, any care or concern.
I believe that Shauna has the ability to express these emotions and doesn't understand them, hence why her presentation is so bizarre. I mean, your partner's stepsister, who you know well, has gone missing and you didn't realise people were out looking. I don't know about you, but if someone I cared about went missing, you couldn't drag me away from searching every single nook and cranny.
I'd be pounding the streets every minute of every day. The police also noticed this strange presentation, as well as the fact that Nathan and Shauna's stories matched perfectly. Human memory is bad. People can have widely different recollections of the same incident, so having two people give exactly the same story is suspicious, and it was clear they'd both come up with the story and rehearsed it, which was basically they went to the house, didn't see Becky, but heard the door slam, so assumed that she just left. I imagine it was at this point the police knew that Becky was not alive anymore, and they had spoken to the people responsible, but they needed evidence to make the arrest. Police returned to Becky's property and found a small amount of blood outside her bedroom door with a fingerprint in it. The blood was found to be Becky's, and the fingerprint belonged to Nathan. This was enough, and Nathan and Shauna were arrested for kidnapping on the 28th of February 2015, and, with their in police custody, their house was forensically examined. These photos show the inside of the property that Shauna and Nathan and I assume their daughter lived in. It's actually disgusting. There's piles of rubbish everywhere. However, the police noticed the bath was absolutely spotless. By making this one area spotless, it acted like a massive beacon, and the police knew that someone had gone to great lengths to clean this room for some reason, and obviously it would later be discovered that Becky had been dismembered in the bath. The pair had spent days cleaning up the horrific scene. Police also found receipts for the circular saw used to dismember Becky, as well as gloves, goggles, and other items used in this despicable crime. On the 2nd of March 2015, both Nathan and Shauna, who remained in police custody, were arrested on suspicion of Becky's murder. On the 2nd of March 2015, after days of questioning, with all the evidence stacking up against him, Nathan Matthews gave the following prepared statement to the police, which reads, quote, "I, Nathan Charles Matthews, date of birth 9th of January 1987, accept that I am responsible for the death of Rebecca Watts. On the 19th of February 2015, I attended 18 Crown Hill with my girlfriend Shauna Hoare. 18 Crown Hill is where my mother lives with Darren Galsworthy. Rebecca Watts also lived there. Shauna is my mother's registered carer, so we regularly go to the house to help with housework and help with my mother's needs. Although we usually went on Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays, we'd also go there on other days. On Thursday the 19th of February, part of the reason for going around was to return a tin to my grandmother. My grandmother was due to take my mother to a medical appointment and bring her back. In my car, I had a large bag, a stun device, handcuffs, tape and mask. I developed an idea to scare Rebecca by kidnapping her. I wanted to kidnap her to teach her a lesson. I believed that she was selfish and her behaviour towards my mother was a risk to her health. When we got to 18 Crown Hill, we let ourselves in with a key my mother had left in the recycling box. Upon entering the property, we all went to the front room. A few minutes after arriving, Shauna said she wanted a cigarette and went to the garden. I went to the boot of my car and took out a bag which contained the other items. I took everything upstairs to the landing. I think I then took the items out of the bag before knocking on Rebecca's door. She replied, "What?" or "Hello?" and I said, "Can I see you a minute?" or similar words. Rebecca then opened the door. I am wearing a mask. I cannot be sure in what order things happened immediately after she came to the door, but I used the items I had to subdue Rebecca. During a short struggle, my mask slipped and Rebecca was able to see my face. This caused me to panic and I strangled her when she was partially in the bag. I collected the items I'd used, put them and Rebecca into the bag and zipped up the bag. I also took her phone, tablet and laptop together with shoes, some clothes and a duvet cover from the spare room in a separate bag. I took everything downstairs. I put it into the boot of my car. Back in the house, I waited to hear Shauna, then slammed the front door shut. Before going to the front door, I checked that Shauna was not in that room. The rest of the day at the house goes as it would normally if we were there. We leave at around 7 p.m. The rest of the evening passed as usual, but I cannot remember exactly what we did. After Shauna went to bed and sleep, I waited a while, went out to the car and brought the bags into the house. The following day, we went back to 18 Crown Hill and I tried to behave as normal. I tried to behave as normal as I could. When we returned to 14 Cotton Mill Lane, I again waited for Shauna to go to sleep. This time, I collected the bag of Rebecca's body and placed it in the bath. In order to stop Shauna using the bathroom the following morning, I poured drain cleaner down the toilet so I could tell Shauna it was blocked again. The toilet would often get blocked, and when this happened, I knew Shauna would not go into the bathroom. I also locked the door. My memory of the days that followed is not perfect, so I'm not sure which day I returned to 14 Cotton Mill Lane, having left Shauna at her mother's, but I think it was the Saturday. When I got back to 14 Cotton Mill Lane, I tried to dispose of the body by cutting it up with a circular saw. Initially, I wrapped up the body parts and took them downstairs and hid them. I'm not sure how many days later, but on another day, I took the body, the saw, and other items to 9 Barton Court, Barton Hill, and placed them in a garden shed. I took them to this address with 2 other people. I did not tell them what was in the bags and box, and I said I would collect them in a few days. Both these people are men, but I do not want to name them. I've chosen to give my account by means of a written statement because I believe I have mental health and learning difficulties that make it difficult for me to say it out loud. So to summarise, Nathan's claiming manslaughter. He had some ridiculous plan to kidnap Becky to teach her a lesson because she was being mean to his mother. She struggled and he strangled her in a moment of panic. Also note that he's trying to claim Shauna is innocent and had nothing to do with any part of this, which is ridiculous, as I've already hinted at but will return to in a bit. This confession is so stupid. I mean, literally, he should have just written the word derp on a piece of paper and it would make more sense. Anyway, this clip shows around 10 minutes of the interview with Nathan, when the police then tried to question him about the statement he had made. This is one of the most pathetic interviews I've ever seen. This is a man who methodically cut his 16-year-old stepsister into pieces and was smirking during his first police interviews. But now, notice the change in him. Notice the performance, the manipulation. Now he's poor little Nathan. He did a bad thing because Becky was being mean to everyone. Oh, and he has mental health issues and learning difficulties, don't forget. And he's very, very upset. I'm really sorry.
This interview is being recorded at Patchway Police Station in Bristol. It is now Tuesday, the 3rd of March 2015, and it's exactly 12 midday. I'm DC 3302, Marie Stephen, and the other police officer present is
DC Mark Luther 2702.
Nathan, can you give us your full name?
Nathan Charles Matthews.
Thank you. And your date of birth?
The 9th of the 1st, 1987.
Thank you. And the other people present in the interview are?
Robin Rowland on behalf of Crossroads Sisters.
And Liz Warlock, a pervert adult.
Thank you. So Nathan, we've had a short break. Perhaps if I just flag up for the recording what this interview is about. It's about the kidnap and murder of Becky Watts. Over the last couple of days we've had 4 recordings. The last was a very short recording and I know you needed to have a break then. I explained to you this morning why we needed to, rather than simply take at face value the written statement that you have given to us last night, that we need to explore what you've told us some more. I know that was difficult for you first thing this morning, but that's what we need to carry on and do and ask you some more questions.
Can you rephrase I don't know what questions you need to ask, but obviously you said something about Shauna. Can you rephrase it? So you can include basically everybody in it and not use her name. Like,
do you want me to say
I think, yeah,
like
the other person? Is it just saying the name?
Just include everybody. And like,
Yeah.
obviously she's in. Obviously, it will be included in it, but include everybody. Don't say her name.
Okay. Okay. I'll do my best to avoid using that name where I can, Nathan, okay? I can't make promises, and what I would say to you is that I'm not going to be doing anything to deliberately wind you up or anything like that, okay? But we've obviously been here a long time, and if I make a slip up, it may well be because I'm tired and those things happen, okay? Can you tell me then, Nathan, because if we work through what you told us in this written statement, this idea that you had...
obviously used, I think you wanted more detail,
yeah.
was it?
Yeah, I do.
Obviously I should be able to go into more detail.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the discussion we had before coming in, though?
Huh?
Remember the discussion we had before coming in?
I don't know.
There are a couple of
Are
ways...
you gonna have to read that statement?
No. There are a couple of ways we could get around this.
Obviously I don't want that to be read to someone.
I don't want to read this out in full again, Nathan, but what I wanted to do was get some more detail from you about things that you've said in it. So perhaps if I could pull out some things from what you've told us and ask you to expand on it, tell us a bit more. Does that sound all right? How about if we start with this idea you had about scaring Becky? Tell me about how that started up then, how you got that idea.
I don't know if it was on TV or something like that, but obviously I had a couple of dreams about...
I think at this point, I can't keep interrupting, but do you remember the discussions we had before you came into interview? And how you and I discussed you dealing with the interview?
What was the question again?
About the idea that you got, and you said it might have been something on TV or you had a dream.
Well, obviously I came up with the idea to scare her, because, like, to try and basically make her more appreciative of life, so she'd be more appreciative for other people. She'd be, like, grateful that, you know, she wasn't harmed or anything like that, or, you know, because obviously she'd leave things out on the floor for my mum to trip over, and obviously would talk to her, like, so saying nasty comments and talk to her like dirt on the floor. And obviously I thought if I was, you know, able to scare her, and obviously her not be harmed and obviously be released, obviously when she got back she obviously would have been scared and more appreciative of things, as people are.
Okay. So tell me what you thought you were going to do. What your plan was.
So obviously stick her in the suitcase. Obviously, put tape around her mouth so she wouldn't make any noise. And then...
I don't want to interrupt you, Nathan, but just one thing, it might be difficult to hear this later. Do you reckon you could speak up a bit?
Obviously, the plan was obviously once I got her in the car to make up something to say to Shauna, obviously I had to leave, like to help someone or do something or something. And obviously I was gonna I was thinking of like a wooded area or whatever to obviously take her back out, obviously still have the mask on, and obviously like scare her and, you know, say something along the lines of, you know, you've got to start treating people better, you know, not being a bitch or self-centered, and then like make a threat of you know, or this could happen again or worse or something like that. And obviously I hadn't figured out exactly how to obviously walk away after, without obviously, I don't know if she'd try and follow. I'm assuming she wouldn't have followed, because out of fear we wouldn't want to follow someone who just obviously has done that. and obviously would have come back. But I would have obviously chucked away obviously everything first and then come back, and obviously would have acted as normal. Kept going back to my mum's, and obviously acted as normal.
So when did you think all of this up?
I can't be certain. I'm no good with dates. I've said this repeatedly, and days muddle into other days. I don't have a specific memory of coming up with it, but I remember thinking about it a couple of times. Just basically trying to think of ways to... Because obviously she won't listen to me about leaving shit on the floor for my mum to trip up on. She doesn't listen to her dad about it. Just trying to find a way of making her actually listen.
Had you had a conversation with her soon before that?
I can't remember when I last saw her. Like I said in the statement, it could have been Wednesday when we went over, or it could have been the Monday before. It depends on when she was in and when she wasn't in, and if she was in, it depends on when she would have come down.
Do you think you want some legal advice at this stage, given that this is going differently than we discussed?
I don't know, probably here.
Okay. It's 12:11 p.m.
Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. The whiny noises that come from this creature, with him clearly trying to gain as much sympathy as possible. Nathan's quote-unquote confession meant that finally, on March the 3rd, 2015, police attended the home of J. Dean Parsons and Carl Demetrius at 9 Barton Court, arrested them both for assisting an offender, and recovered the suitcases containing Becky's remains from the shed in their garden. They also recovered suitcases and a rucksack that contained, amongst other things, the power saw, blood-stained safety goggles, a screwdriver, handcuffs, blood-stained drain cleaner bottles, blood-stained pliers, and face masks. Later, in Nathan Shaughner's property, a stun gun was recovered. Based on the discovery and his confession, on the 4th of March 2015, Nathan Matthews was charged with the murder of Becky Watts and remanded into custody to await his day in court. Shaughner was charged with perverting the course of justice, basically lying to the police about Nathan's movements, and she was remanded into prison, but this was clearly a holding charge. They knew she was involved and just needed the evidence to prove it. This clip shows part of an interview with Shaughner after the discovery of Becky's body, where she denies and deflects and claims no knowledge of anything, no matter how obvious this lie was.
Is there anything else in relation to Becca's body being found at your house?
If it found at my house, do you know where she was found?
No. Would you know that?
No. That was where it's more of a curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where he would have hid her, so to speak. I don't know.
Okay. Claire, have you got anything to?
Yeah. If I know that you've said about I wouldn't have any evidence on her, no hair, no skin cells or things like that. But that doesn't stop you from not, just because you might not have touched, but you like not knowing. I'm trying to rephrase this. But that doesn't stop you from actually knowing that she was there.
Again,
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I suppose there's no reason that you should or shouldn't believe me. I can just obviously tell you that I genuinely had no idea. I can't even look at him. I was sat in the courtroom today and I just wanted to... I say kill him, that's a bad choice of words. I felt sick looking at him, knowing what he did. And yeah, I didn't always like Becky, but she was a nice enough girl. She was so young.
Shaughner didn't realise that she just walked herself into a trap. By claiming that she had not touched anything, if her fingerprints or DNA could be found on any items recovered, they could prove that she was lying. Also, as already outlined, there's clear evidence of them discussing abducting teenage girls, which the police already knew about. Police got a break when they found Shauna's DNA on one of the face masks they recovered, as well as on one of the cases containing Becky's remains and on bin bags used to wrap her body. So, on the 22nd of June 2015, Shauna Hall was also charged with Becky's murder and remained in prison to await her fate. Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hall went on trial on the 6th of October 2015 at Bristol Crown Court. The pathetic waste of skin called Nathan continued with his fucking ridiculous story. His intention was to kidnap Becky in order to teach her a lesson, and that she had been killed whilst trying to do this. He continues to claim that Shauna had no part in this. Shauna echoed this, playing dumb and pretending she had no idea what had gone on. The prosecution had a wealth of evidence to prove their case, that this was a, quote, sexually motivated kidnap plot carried out by Nathan and Shauna. Their defences fell apart quickly when it could easily be proven that Nathan had a sexual interest in children, especially ones who looked like Becky, and he and Shauna had discussed about kidnapping a teenage girl. With regards to Shauna, her DNA was found on items that she couldn't possibly have touched unless she was involved. Also, there was the ridiculous idea that she would not have heard a young girl fighting for her life or questioned Nathan carrying a large, heavy bag randomly out of the property on the day that she visited. In addition, as already mentioned, the prosecution argued that Nathan would have needed help moving the body, and this would have come from Shauna. Adding to this, Shauna was shown to be with Nathan during the time he'd been dismembering Becky's body, and not at her mother's. She also went with Nathan to various shops to buy cleaning products, claiming that she didn't know what this was for. Lastly, there was also her online internet activity, including finding a parody song which referenced hiding a body. The case was so strong that it only took the jury 3 hours to find Nathan Matthews guilty of the murder of Becky Watts, and due to her role, Shauna Hall was found guilty of her manslaughter. In addition, both were convicted of conspiracy to kidnap, perversion of the course of justice, preventing the lawful burial of a body, and possession of 2 stun guns, whilst Nathan was also convicted of possession of indecent images of children. In addition, Jadine Parsons and Carl Demetrius, the couple whose shed was used to hide Becky's body, were convicted of assisting an offender, and Jadine was subsequently sent to prison for 16 months. Carl was sent down for 2 years. With regards to Nathan and Shauna, on the 13th of November 2015, they stood before Mr. Justice Dingmans for sentencing. He was barely able to contain his emotions and was later seen to leave the court in tears. He stated that Nathan and Shauna's crimes, including dismembering Becky, were actions that, quote, defy any reasonable explanation. He highlighted the clear sexual motivation for this crime, and whilst there was no evidence to indicate that Shauna had actually been the one to kill Becky, she was shown to be an integral part of this plan. He also said, quote, Mr. Matthews and Miss Hall lied to the family and to the police, pretending not to know anything about Becky's whereabouts at a time when they were in the process of dismembering her. Their deceit to the family was particularly cruel and unusual, and the family's sense of betrayal by Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hall is both understandable and justified. At the same time they were deceiving the family, Matthews and Hall were watching a parody of a song from Frozen, using the words, "Do you want to hide a body?" It's apparent that neither Nathan Matthews or Shauna Hall have truthfully said what happened at 18 Crown Hill to Becky, and I understand the family's sense of frustration about that fact. He then sentenced them. For the murder of Becky Watts, Nathan Matthews was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 33 years before he's eligible to apply for parole. For the manslaughter of Becky Watts, Shauna Hall was sentenced to 17 years imprisonment. Both later appealed their sentences, but they were both denied. People who offend against children are considered the lowest of the low in prison, and some measure of retribution was waiting for Nathan and Shauna after they were sentenced. With regards to Nathan, in January 2017, he was reported to have been badly burnt when another inmate threw boiling hot water over him at the high-security prison H&P Long Lartin. Shauna appears to have had an even worse time than Nathan. In 2016, it was stated that she'd been beaten so badly by other inmates that she'd had to be resuscitated twice. It appears, though, that Shauna survived prison, and given she would had to have served half her sentence before being released on licence, and taking into account time on remand, she's likely already out of prison or will soon be released on licence to be monitored by probation for the next 8.5 years. No doubt she'll have to keep a very low profile now and for the rest of her life. Nathan has another 25 years before he can even apply for parole if he survives that long. But, given the heinous nature of his crimes, whether he will ever be considered safe to be released is unclear. Becky Watts was laid to rest on the 17th of April 2015 at St Ambrose Church in Whitehall in Bristol. Hundreds of people lined the streets, and, at a request from her family, many wore t-shirts featuring her photograph and threw pink roses towards the horse-drawn carriage which took her on her final journey. Becky's grave was decorated with blue chippings, her favourite colour, and the inscription on her gravestone reads, quote, "Bristol's Angel, Becky, Rebecca Marie Watts, beautiful, affectionate, talented, loyal daughter and friend, taken from us 19th of February 2015, age 16. Bex was loved by everyone, will be missed by all who knew her. Rest in peace, my child." Tanya Watts, Becky's biological mother, did not feel able to attend the service, who paid tribute to her daughter by calling her a, quote, "caring, normal, happy, lovely girl," as well as saying, "You shouldn't have to bury a child. There are lots of people on this earth who don't deserve to be here, but Becky weren't one of them. She should be here." Her father Darren and her stepmother Angie were devastated by Becky's death and the ultimate betrayal of both Nathan and Shauna. Darren subsequently released a statement speaking for both he and Angie, which read in part, quote, "We both feel we are just marking off time until our demise. Everything beautiful in our lives has been ripped from us in one selfish act of violence. The pain cuts deep into our families. It's destroyed long-standing relationships and marriages. Our children have become isolated and bullied at school. We can't go outside of the house without people pointing at us or making comments which they believe we can't hear. When I close my eyes to sleep, I see Becky's death over and over again. I see what they did to my child. I hear her cry out, 'What are you doing?' Then I feel her terror as she realizes they're not going to stop, and she is about to die. I feel her heart racing. I see all this, and I'm powerless to help her. All too frequently, I awake drenched in sweat and physically shaking. Becky was so small and fragile, she never stood a chance. These nightmares consume my every thought. Like advanced cancer, they haunt my days and terrorize my nights. This is the reality of what transpired that day, a legacy I cannot escape. This is my life now." Darren also spoke later about seeing his daughter for the last time, and despite the efforts of the morticians who had sewn Becky back together and wrapped the cuts in bandages, he said he could still see where his daughter had been decapitated. Angie's health declined rapidly after this point, losing the girl she loved like a daughter and raising a monster of a son who could do this. She completely cut Nathan out of her life. I have no real updates about either Darren or Angie. I know they remained married for several years after this incident, but I'm not sure where they are now. However, what is known is that a beautiful young woman who had so much of her life ahead of her was murdered, taken from this life before she'd even had a chance to live it. She wasn't just taken away from her loved ones, but she was robbed of her opportunity to have a family. They destroyed all the laughter, the joy she would have had, her chance to make a mark on the world, which I've no doubt she would have done. Becky, with all my heart, I hope you're at peace. Sleep well, Angel. It's impossible not to talk about these two together, but I'll also discuss differences in their profiles. Nathan Matthews, in my opinion, is much easier to understand. A sad little man who, likely due to his own inadequacies, including his height, wanted to dominate and control women as a way to feel powerful. He likely felt that on a level, he was no match for a woman, had little to offer them, and there would inevitably abandon him. So he targeted children. He knew these individuals would be more naive than him, and he could mold them into what he wanted them to be. Becky was a precocious teenager who knew her own mind, had a strong personality, and was going places compared to him. A man who could not hold down a job, who lived in absolute squalor. This disparity enraged him. He was also sexually obsessed with her and wanted to dominate her and take what he believed he was entitled to. His plan would enable him to achieve both of these goals, use Becky sexually and remove this object from his life. And I say object purposefully. I have no doubt that Nathan is a psychopath. He has no remorse for his actions, saw Becky and all women and female children simply as things he could use. He methodically dismembered the body of a 16-year-old child and then sat in an interview with the police smirking. Only when he was trying to save himself did he show any sort of emotion, and this was manufactured, a pantomime, with his sole purpose being to sell this bullshit story to save his own skin. Nathan Matthews is a dangerous man who I think will always pose a risk to children. In some respects, I find the profile of Shauna Hall more interesting, as it is, in my opinion, far more complex. I've said what I thought about her during this video, with Shauna being a victim initially, falling into the hands of a manipulative, controlling predatory paedophile who moulded her for years, contributing to the monster she became. However, the more I watch her interviews, the more I'm convinced that Nathan merely built upon something that was already within Shauna, or, to be more accurate, missing from her. She is cold. There is something missing when she speaks. She talks, but there is no emotion there. She's literally like a robot. She shows no signs of distress and seems incapable of even pretending to care during her police interviews. I think she too is likely a psychopath, who over the years began to become sexually aroused by thoughts of abducting children for Nathan to abuse. The thing that I think cements my perception of these two as psychopaths is, as I said, the fact they were parents themselves to a female child. Especially with Shauna. Becoming a mother appears to have done nothing to change her. She did not then realise the love that other mothers have for their children, and how losing a child is the worst thing a parent can experience. She gave no consideration to keeping that child out of harm's way, or being in their life. No, instead, she allowed them to live in absolute squalor, and took them to an address knowing exactly what was going to happen, and then, likely, had this child in the house where Becky's body was cut up. The same thing goes for Nathan. He couldn't give a shit about anyone else, including his daughter. His needs to indulge his sick sexual interest in children was all that mattered. I've read that Shauna was apparently pregnant again with twins when Becky was murdered. So, again, rather than thinking about the lives inside of her and her own daughter, she was slowly focused on helping her paedophile partner end the life of someone else's child. As to what happened to these twins, a report in late 2015 said that Shauna was, quote, no longer pregnant. It's unclear whether she had termination, lost the babies, or potentially she was never pregnant at all, and simply said this to gain sympathy. In addition, I have no idea what happened to the couple's daughter. She'll be around 10 years old now, and I really hope that she's being supported by people who love her, and they'll help her with the emotional fallout when she finds out what monsters her parents were. Shauna, as I said, is either released or will soon be back in the world, and she will have to keep a low profile and look over her shoulder for the rest of her life. And Nathan, he gets to enjoy at least the next 25 years with his new friends. Let's see how that goes. There are clear parallels between this case and the Ken and Barbie murders. This case relates to a couple, Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. Bernardo was a serial rapist and serial killer who killed at least 3 young women, with Carla assisting him with finding him victims, including her 15-year-old sister, Tammy. I will be covering that case in the near future.